This is a CBS News special report, Campaign 76. Election night from CBS News election headquarters in New York. This portion is sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company. On behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers, Ford wants to be your car company. Now, here is Walter Cronkite.
And good evening from our CBS News election headquarters. We don't know whether this is going to be a long night or not. The story is that it was a very close race. Certainly a lot of people turned out today. It turns out to have been perhaps a record turnout across the nation, all across the country. From Maine out to the Pacific coast, every state almost, it seems, reported more people out than they had anticipated. The vote is already coming in. 8 states have closed their polling places now, and on the basis of our sample precincts in 2 of those states, we can estimate winners. In the state of Kentucky, CBS News estimates that Carter will win in that state, defeating President Ford for Kentucky's 9 electoral votes. By the final percentage, we believe there will be, in Kentucky, 52% for Carter, 48% for Ford. Also in the state of Indiana, our CBS News estimate is that Ford will win in the state of Indiana, defeating Carter there. The electoral vote in Indiana, 13 electoral votes there. Ford, we estimate, will get 55% of the votes, and Carter about 45% when all the votes are finally tabulated in the state of Indiana. Both of those states were expected to go as they did go. If they had not gone that way, it would have been an early indication that the candidate and the challenger, respectively, were in difficulty. We do not have that indication so far from those 2 states. We also have been able to say, on the basis of our sample precincts in the state of Indiana, that Vance Hartke has been retired from the United States Senate after 3 terms as the Democratic representative from Indiana there, and the new senator from Indiana will be the Republican Richard Lugar, the former mayor of Indianapolis, once called President Nixon's favorite mayor, a title he's been trying to live down. In Indiana also, Governor Bowen, the Republican governor, has been reelected according to our CBS News estimate. As we say, the turnout heavy across the country, perhaps helped by very good weather across the nation. Sunny skies and warm temperatures in most of the country. A little bit of snow, we're told, in upper New England. A little bit of rain around the Great Lakes, a shower or 2 in Florida and out in Washington State, but otherwise nothing substantial. The popular vote, we've had 2% of the precincts counted so far, and it appears that right now President Ford has taken an early lead in that popular vote. He's got about 53% of the vote, Carter 47%. As you see, the vote total has just gone over a million mark. Ford 564,000 almost, Carter just a little over 500,000, 500,000 and a half. Now let's take a look at where some of these, what is happening in some of the areas around the country on this big election day, our bicentennial election day, our 48th presidential election. Roger Mudd will give us a report from the South. Roger?
Walter, both sides agreed that if Jimmy Carter could carry Kentucky by about 55 or 56%, it would mean that a solid South would be lining up behind him tonight. That is not the case. If we take a look at the Kentucky vote board, you'll see that with just under half of the precincts in Kentucky, Jimmy Carter is trailing President Ford by about 1%. Our CBS News estimate shows that when all these votes are in, and that includes a heavily Democratic western part of the state, Carter will be the winner by 52%. Jimmy Carter tonight is running well in the small towns, and in the rural areas he is picking up what used to be known in Kentucky as the Wallace vote. Ford doing well in the suburbs. But a 52% win in Kentucky means that we're going to have to take a careful look at some other southern states to see whether those danger flags are still flying. We'll be watching out next for Virginia. That is thought to be in Ford's column. If President Ford carries Virginia big, it means that some other losses may be set up in the South. For instance, in Florida, if Carter cannot carry North Carolina easily, it would then raise the possibility of Jimmy Carter losing some crucial states in the deeper South, for instance, Louisiana and Mississippi. So based on the Kentucky returns, Walter, Jimmy Carter is not off to a flying start.
Let's find out about the returns from Indiana, what they mean, from Dan Rather in the Midwest. Dan?
Walter, this is the most important thing about the Midwest at this hour is the Republicans have taken Indiana like Grant took Richmond, overwhelmingly, smashingly. President Ford, with 24% of the vote in and tabulated in Indiana, with a 56% margin. On the basis of our CBS News estimate, when all of the vote is in and tabulated, our estimate is that his winning margin in Indiana could be on the order of 55%. Now, here's one of the reasons why. Reverse coattail effect. Look at the Senate race in Indiana. Richard Lugar, the former mayor of Indianapolis, the Republican candidate, on the basis of the vote that is in and tabulated in his race against the Democratic incumbent Senator Vance Hartke, a terrific victory for Lugar. No one expected Lugar to go this high in the percentage. This is on the basis of the tabulated vote, on the basis of our CBS News estimate. His final winning margin could be on the order of 60%. The Republicans also returning their gubernatorial candidate, Otis Bowen, in Indiana. And President Ford, one reason that he's off to such a good start, maybe as much as 56% of the vote in Indiana, is he rode the coattails of those very strong Republican candidates. Same thing could happen in Illinois, which is the next place to watch. The Republican gubernatorial candidate, James Thompson, expected to win overwhelmingly over the Democratic candidate, Michael Howlett, the Daley protege. If he does as well as expected in Illinois, it could make a difference in what is otherwise expected to be a very close presidential race in Illinois. The big one to watch in the Midwest, though, remains Ohio. The fascinating struggle there could decide the whole election. Call it a toss-up, 25 electoral votes at stake. Keep an eye on it. No returns from Ohio yet, of course, Walter, but we'll be reporting on them to you a little later on.
Ohio has just closed, though, hasn't it, Mike?
Just closed. Just,
right.
7 minutes ago.
Mike Wallace from the East.
Walter, if Jimmy Carter is going to win this election, he needs a big head start in the traditionally Democratic East. There are 3 key states here. New York leading to Carter, 41 electoral votes. Pennsylvania, a toss-up, 27 electoral votes. New Jersey, also a toss-up with 17 votes. That's a total of 85 electoral votes, or just about a third of all the votes that either man needs to win this election. Now, if Jimmy Carter were to win all 3, things would look very bad for Gerald Ford. Ford's own people acknowledge that. If Ford, however, were to take Pennsylvania and Connecticut, he would be a very, very happy man. The early turnout today in all 3 states was very big, and that is supposed to be good for Carter. Labor had promised to get Carter's voters to the polls. Apparently, they are delivering. You remember that John Kennedy fashioned his narrow win over Richard Nixon back in 1960 by taking 141 of the East's then 153 electoral votes. Carter would like to do the same, but we won't be getting any significant votes from the East for about an hour. We'll let you know what's going on then. Walter?
And of course, the polls are still open in most of the western states, which is Leslie Stahl's territory. But Leslie, what should we be watching for out there?
Well, Walter, we should be watching, everyone will be watching, what happens in California. Because with its 45 electoral votes, it's the nation's largest single block of electoral votes, and it comprises 1/6 the number needed to win the election. Early indications from California are that voter turnout is high all over the state in both traditionally Democratic and Republican counties. Last-minute soundings in California put the presidential race at a virtual toss-up. There is some evidence that a California poll putting President Ford ahead there by 6 points may be making a difference. The poll was published last week, and it is said to have jolted many of the undecided Democrats over into Carter's column. Also, analysts say that a last-minute visit to California by Jimmy Carter and a statewide television appearance with the popular Governor Jerry Brown have improved Carter's chances and have moved that race into a dead heat. Outside of California, the West is the country's most conservatively Republican. President Ford is expected to do very well in the Rocky Mountain states. He may win all of them. The Carter campaign wrote off most of those states. But unless Ford wins California, he cannot win the election. His own analysts have said as much. The West as a region can be described by superlatives. It's the nation's largest geographically. It's nearly half the area of the entire United States. But in electoral votes, it's the smallest, less than 20%. And of course, Walter, our returns come in the latest.
Of course, Leslie, but that means that you can't go home until all of us go home, and that's a good thing for all of us. What you report about California, people making up their minds rather late there in the last-minute swings, is indicated all the way across the country by our CBS News Election Day poll of voters leaving the polling booths. It indicated that 20% of those who responded to us say they've made up their mind in the last few days, and interestingly enough, they split almost evenly between President Ford and Jimmy Carter. So it seems that if there was any momentum for either man going, and the stories were it was going for President Ford, it had come to an even point there in the last few days, at any rate, according to that indicator. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. The CBS News vote profile analysis, the thing we make those CBS News estimates of winners from, is based on returns from sample precincts throughout a state. Now, when taken together, they reflect voting patterns in the entire state, and we can make our estimates. In addition, CBS News conducts an Election Day survey, which is based on interviews with voters at sample precincts throughout the country as they leave the voting places. So far, we've questioned today 6,887 voters as they left polling places in 130 scientifically selected precincts around the nation. Now, Bruce Morton's in charge of our trend desk, and he's going to tell us how that estimate works, and will give us some early survey results, I hope. Bruce?
Walter, I want to make it clear I didn't ask very many of those questions myself. We'll keep getting a larger and larger sample as the evening goes on. As the sample gets larger, it gets better, and we ought, we think, to be able to say increasingly true and sophisticated things about how people voted, how different groups of Americans voted, and why they voted the way they did. Our first sample, as Walter said, is in, and we're learning some things from it. In 1968 and 72, the Democrats split, of course, and their candidates lost the White House. So one of the questions nagging political observers all this year has been whether Jimmy Carter could bring the old Democratic coalition back together. Well, it's too early for a full answer yet, too early to tell how much of the solid South he's regained, for instance, but we do know some things that indicate that some, at least, of those old Democrats came home today. Of those Democrats in our sample who voted for Richard Nixon 4 years ago, 60% today voted for Jimmy Carter, 3 out of 5. And you can see that same trend by looking at some groups that are traditionally Democratic. Carter leads among Catholics in our sample, 54 to 45. The CBS News 1972 survey showed that Richard Nixon carried Catholic voters. Carter leads among blue-collar workers in our sample, 60 to 40. Richard Nixon carried that group 4 years ago, too. We show Carter doing very well among black voters. So did George McGovern 4 years ago. In fact, that's really what seems to be working for Carter now. We show the white voters in our sample just about evenly divided between the two men. One reason for this move back to the Democratic Party may be that Watergate still seems to be alive as an issue. Carter voters in our sample said Carter would restore trust to government, though Ford voters said the same thing about their men. And the Carter voters cited Watergate and the Nixon pardon as a big reason for voting for Carter. Asked what they disliked about Ford, again, the thing those Carter voters said most was that Ford had pardoned Richard Nixon. So there are some signs tonight that Watergate lives as an issue, some signs that Carter is putting at least a part of that old Democratic coalition back together. Walter?
Bruce, I got just a little bit confused there. Did you say that, that Carter was winning the Catholic vote?
In our sample so far he is, and you know that's traditionally been a Democratic vote.
Right. I think maybe the graphic was confused and confused me, but it is Carter with the Catholic votes. Thank you. Eric Severide and Bill Moyers have some thoughts now on tonight's large voter turnout and what it may mean. Eric?
Well, very partial thoughts and very partial returns so far. The turnout, of course, is the big thing here. The size of the vote can determine the nature of the result, I would think, wouldn't you, Bill? This is possible. I would think that an awful lot of people in the last few weeks were just keeping their own counsel about how they were going to vote, or they just literally had not made up their minds. I think perhaps the latter more than the former. 4 years ago, 60% of the people who voted for Richard Nixon made up their minds by Labor Day. We had no such indications this time. It's come rather with a rush. A lot of the so-called independents are in that group. I think they were just people, don't you, who were slow to come to a decision.
Yes, they were uncertain, undecided. I think the apathy peaked too soon in this particular election. Right. And I asked the Democratic chairman of Maine today what was happening up there. Harold Patience is his name. He said it's a huge turnout. I said, how do you explain it? And he said, well, I think the sporting blood of Americans has come out in this election. It's a horse race, and the people believe that their cheers might help their horse, so they got out and voted.
Well, that raised a great question, you know, about the polls, Bill. Sure, the polls made it the horse race. Those figures kept narrowing as the weeks went by. It made it very exciting until they came right down to the wire, and none of the big pollers said they could call it. So that makes for a big turnout. It's a big part of the turnout. And therefore, and since the turnout can affect the actual outcome of the vote, then I think it raises a lot of questions about these polls. Doesn't it, you?
Yes, it does. And I think the polls could not reflect accurately what was happening as a result of the debates. It's interesting to me that in the largest turnout since the World War II was the election of 1960 when there were debates. I think these debates have made a considerable difference in this turnout.
I do too. I think they sharpened the whole thing very much. Apparently, from everything that Bruce has been telling us and the figures back there, the Democrats are returning to their party, voting the party principle almost more than anything else. But that 33% or so called independents are still the key to this. It's very early and partial return, but that first return indicating that they're splitting rather even in the farms and the suburbs would indicate that, on the face of it, that Mr. Ford may be in some trouble. And that's a terribly early return, and I wouldn't want to make any bets on the basis of that.
One little point that I live in a precinct where there are more Republicans than people, and people weren't expecting them to turn out. I got in my car and drove around to several precincts this afternoon. I was amazed to find that even in a relatively affluent, relatively well-educated ward, the voters were in line. They were there in heavier numbers than in '72 when they were voting for Nixon. Found enormous good humor, sense of excitement, a feeling of this old quadrennial camaraderie. See, I think an election does us good.
Well, the press was saying for weeks that the whole election was leaving a sour taste in everybody's mouth. I don't believe it, not on this evidence, do you?
No, I don't. One other thing it seems to me that's worked is Henry Steele Commager once said that Americans invented the future, the belief that no matter how bad things get today, they can be better tomorrow. And I think they go to the polls and say, well, no matter Watergate and Vietnam and all these problems, my vote's going to make it better tomorrow.
America also invented the modern political party, and we rather cherish our original possessions, so I think we'll keep on with these two parties for some time. Back now to you, Walter.
I suppose, Bill Moyers, that you were touring those various precincts as a journalist, not as a voter. It's been known to happen in the past, not with you, but I just want to check on that. CBS News estimate now for the state of Alabama. Enough returns are in there from our sample precincts so that we can say that Jimmy Carter certainly will win in Alabama. That's no surprise that he will defeat President Ford. We don't have a percentage figure on that yet, but as I say, it's no surprise. Governor Wallace was out working hard for the ticket this year in his native state of Alabama, and the Democratic Party was united, so Alabama has gone back into the Democratic ranks for the first time in several elections. In the past, it's been going for the various Southern candidates, American independent candidacy of George Wallace himself. So there's another state, second state for Jimmy Carter. He had Kentucky earlier, as we reported to you, and President Ford has taken Indiana. The percentage in Alabama, we now believe, will be around 64% for Carter, 36% for Ford when all those votes are in. And now, with 2% of the precincts counted across the nation, the percentage lead for President Ford has been whittled just a bit. It was running at 52 to 48%, and it's now down to 51 at 48%. That's 709,000, as you see, 669,000 some odd for Carter. Eugene McCarthy, the former senator from Minnesota and one-time presidential aspirant himself back in 1968, has gotten 1% of the vote and has cut down that Ford lead by that proportion. Lester Maddox also is on the ballot in many states across the nation as the American Independent Party candidate, and he is not yet showing enough of a percentage to get on the board. The number of voters across the nation, as we have said before, may turn out to be a record this year. If so, it will beat the 1960 modern record when in that year some 63.1% of the voters turned out, as Bill Moyers and Eric were noting just a little while ago. If that number turn out this year, we'll have a vote of something like 94.5 million out of the 105 million registered to vote. That will be quite a surprise after the predictions that this was going to be a low turnout this year. The lowest turnout in modern times was that in 1948. It was a close race that year, but nobody knew it at the time. Everybody thought Dewey was going to sweep to victory, and Harry Truman came from behind to win, but only 51.1%, barely half of the registered voters turned out in 1948. This is Walter Cronkite at our CBS News election headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night. From CBS News election headquarters in New York, here again is Walter Cronkite.
Hello again from our CBS News election headquarters. In the state of Georgia, we have an estimated winner here at CBS News. On the basis of our sample precincts, it is our belief that Jimmy Carter will win the state of Georgia. He defeats President Ford there when all of the votes are tallied, and will get that state's 12 electoral votes. We do not have a percentage yet for that estimate. That's the third state that we have been able to say that Carter has won in Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia. Let's take a look at the popular vote in so far. 2% of the nation's precincts have been counted, and look at that. It's a dead even race at this point, with just a few hundred votes separating the two candidates. Ford has 819,316, Carter 818,985, 50% each, as that breaks down with the percentages going off beyond the decimal point to a figure we haven't even calculated for our boards. On the electoral votes, as we said a moment ago, the challenger has won 3 states with a total of 30 electoral votes: Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia. And according to our CBS News estimate, President Ford has taken Indiana with its 13 electoral votes. And now let's take a look more detailed at some developing races of great interest in the South. Roger Mudd can report to us on them. Roger?
Walter, the danger signals that came out of Kentucky are now being seen and heard in Florida. That was a state considered fairly well in Carter's column. In fact, the Ford people decided at the last minute not to go into Florida during the final Ford blitz because they thought there wasn't any point in doing it. But tonight, if you'll take a look at the popular vote in Florida, you'll notice with just 2% of the precincts in, Ford is out ahead. But much of that vote indicates that both Ford and Carter are splitting the small towns and even the large cities. So Jerry Ford is doing much better than he thought, and Jimmy Carter in the strong Democratic areas is breaking only roughly even. If we take now a look at Georgia, which was the expected bastion of the Carter strength, you'll find Carter way out ahead, almost 73%. And in Alabama also, another easy win for Jimmy Carter this evening. 58%, 6% of the precincts in, Ford 41%. The Alabama CBS News estimate shows that when all the votes are in, from north and south through the middle, Carter 63%, Ford 39%. And as expected, Walter, in the Florida Senate race, Lawton Childs, who is going for a second term, has defeated this evening the Republican nominee, John Grady.
Thank you, Roger. It's interesting in those Florida returns, Roger, that Gene McCarthy, with just 2% of the precincts in, but he has 1% of the vote showing in Florida, and Carter 49% of the vote showing. That would indicate that if all of Eugene McCarthy's votes were over there in the Carter column, it would be a little closer race than it is. We do have to watch these third party and independent candidates tonight, the independent candidate being Gene McCarthy. There are 14 other candidates running for the presidency who represent established parties of one kind or another. McCarthy running by himself. McCarthy is considered to be, however, the greater threat. He's on the ballot in 29 states and made an active write-in campaign in several others, including California, and frankly says that he hopes to upset the balance between the two established parties as proof of his point that the people do not get an adequate choice with only two major political parties. It is possible for him to do that. If a state's vote is close enough and he takes enough votes away from either one of the candidates, he could tilt the balance in one state or another toward the other candidate and thus tilt the entire national election. We'll be watching those returns as the evening goes on, of course. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. We've now got 3% of the nation's precincts in, and Jimmy Carter has moved into a lead for the first time in the vote tabulation. He now has 951,000 votes to Ford's 933,000 almost. It's a 50 to 49% lead. That's the first time tonight that he has taken the lead in the vote count. Jimmy Carter now is in Atlanta, where he's going to greet his supporters later this evening at a rally at the World Congress Center. Ed Rabel is there. Ed?
Walter, this is Exhibit Hall C in the World Congress Center. It's a brand new center. This party room is bigger than your average party room, about 350,000 square feet. It's empty now because the Secret Service have been screening and sweeping the area, but a little later on, the Carter staff says that 25 to 30,000 people will jam in here to celebrate what they hope will be a Carter victory. It's going to get very noisy in here. They have big speaker systems strategically located throughout the room to amplify the sounds of bands with names like Choice and Brick and Georgia Power and Bullsboro and Sweet Tooth and Gary and Terry. Those are bluegrass musicians who helped Carter during the primary campaigns. The big TV screens here, 30-foot high TV screens, which will show the latest vote tallies. They're calling this perhaps the biggest bash that Atlanta has ever seen, perhaps bigger than the premiere of the motion picture Gone with the Wind, which was held here in 1939. Thousands of people came here to cheer Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable, who portrayed the make-believe Southerners. A little later on tonight, the crowd will be cheering a real Southerner, Jimmy Carter, who will be marching up that way and onto the stage. Back to you, Walter.
President Ford's following tonight's returns from the White House, and Bob Schieffer's there. Bob?
Walter, there are just two words that can really be used to describe this Ford White House tonight, and that is total exhaustion. President Ford got back late this afternoon from that 10-day, 15,000-mile blitz, the last-minute blitz that he took to try to overcome Jimmy Carter's lead. His voice was almost gone when he got here. His staff was totally exhausted. Even the press corps that had been traveling with him was exhausted. So Mr. Ford just promptly went to bed, took a little nap when he got here. We can't give you very much information beyond that about what's going on here tonight because when the boss decided to go to sleep, the staff followed suit and most of them left and are still at home trying to catch a few hours sleep. They'll be coming back in a few hours. We're told that the president will be watching the returns from the second floor living quarters of the White House tonight. He's invited his running mate Robert Dole and Joe Garagiola, his new sidekick, the man that many people are now calling the unofficial running mate. Garagiola, of course, helped him with those broadcasts, paid political broadcasts that were beamed into the key states around the country during this last week of the campaign. Edith Green, the former congresswoman from Oregon, who also helped on those broadcasts, has also been invited in, we're told. A little later this evening, the president is expected to go to a hotel in northwest Washington where his supporters are throwing a big party. However, we're told he won't go there until after the race has been decided. So, depending on how things go, that may be a very late appearance. Walter?
Bob, any suggestion that a lost voice is going to keep him from making a statement to his supporters there tonight?
Walter, I don't think if he wins this election, if he pulls this off, if he comes from as far behind as he had to come, I don't think you could keep him away from that thing with a team of mules. I think he'll be out there if he has to talk in sign language.
Or if he has to write on the blackboard, huh?
Right.
Right, Bob. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. One-third of the Senate comes up for election every 2 years. This year, 33 senators are up. 22 of them are Democrats. 11 of them are Republicans. That is, those are the seats that were held in the last Congress by those parties. So far tonight, our CBS News estimates are that 4 of the races have been decided. 3 of them, not surprisingly, in favor of the Democrats. 2 of those were uncontested seats, as a matter of fact. John Stennis was returned from Mississippi and Robert Byrd from West Virginia. Lawton Chiles won again in the state of Florida. And on the one race that the Republicans have won, that was a turnover seat. We can get more about that from Dan Rather in the Middle West. Dan?
Walter, Indiana is the whole story for the Republicans at the moment, simply because we have the most numbers from Indiana. Let's take a look first at the presidential race in Indiana and try to explain what happened there. This is the tabulated vote, 36% of it in. President Ford's margin in the range of 55% on the basis of the tabulated vote. Our CBS News estimate is that when all the votes are in and tabulated, Gerald Ford will have carried Indiana by about 53%. Now, the Republicans felt that they had to carry Indiana by at least 53% for Gerald Ford to give themselves high hopes for the rest of the Midwest. So they're within that range, but just barely. Gerald Ford ran well in some traditionally Democratic areas of Indiana. He was on the coattails of 2 very strong candidates for offices in Indiana. Richard Lugar, first the tabulated vote in that Senate race, the former mayor of Indianapolis, wiping out the incumbent Democratic Senator Vance Hartke. This is on the basis of the tabulated vote. Lugar, 61%. Our CBS News estimate is that the final result will see Lugar winning by about 60%. And in the gubernatorial race in Indiana, Otis Bowen becoming the first man in the 20th century to be re-elected as a governor in Indiana.
Could I excuse you just a moment? We're seeing Jimmy Carter at the hotel in Atlanta. Just a moment.
We'll come back to Indiana later.
Right. Fervent interest in the campaign with the size of the crowds and also with the intensity of feeling. And I'm very grateful at the large turnout. I think that's something that works in my favor.
Do you think the turnout indicates that perhaps the polls were wrong all along?
Yeah, well, it's the picture. I was listening to Jimmy Carter there outside the hotel, though, just a moment.
I don't know.
There he is.
Have to wait and see. I don't know.
You are heard in Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia right now. Are you very satisfied with that?
I'm satisfied with those 3 states, yes.
What, are you afraid that your governor didn't get that question? Yeah.
That's Jimmy Carter. He's arriving at the Omni International Hotel in Atlanta, where he's going to watch the early part of the evening's returns at any rate before going over and joining some of his supporters. Dan, continue, if you will, please.
Well, as you may recall, we were in Indiana. We were talking about the gubernatorial race there, going for the Republicans as well as the United States Senate race. This is on the basis of the tabulated vote. Otis Bowen, the Republican, being returned to the Indiana State House. Our CBS News estimate is that Bowen's final margin will be on the order of 58%. Now, while the Republicans have overwhelmingly good news throughout Indiana, including the fact that Gerald Ford ran very well in what had been in some past elections Democratic areas and ran by a margin of about 3-2 in the rural areas, the Democrats got some good news in that Democrat Andy Jacobs Jr. has been re-elected to the 11th Congressional District of Indiana, defeating Republican Lawrence Buell. This year, Jacobs married Representative Martha Keyes, who faces a re-election problem in her own 2nd Congressional District of Kansas, partly because of concern over divided loyalties as a result of her remarriage to Jacobs. So Jacobs, the husband in that family, wins. We'll have to see what happens with Keyes. One important thing, Walter, at this hour I think we should keep in mind, we don't have enough numbers coming out of Illinois yet to say very much except this. On the basis of the early returns, it appears that the Republican gubernatorial candidate in Illinois, James Thompson, is running exceptionally strong for a Republican in the city of Chicago. Keep in mind that his opponent is the hand-picked protege of Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. Also, our very early returns from Illinois indicate that Thompson is running extremely strong in the Chicago suburbs. Now, if that develops into a trend, it could be good news. It could turn out to be the decisive factor in Illinois for Gerald Ford. In Ohio, we have no figures whatsoever, and the Ohio polls closed about 17 minutes ago. The Illinois polls closed about 47 minutes ago. In Ohio, however, the Democrats, rightly or wrongly, believe that labor really delivered for them in Ohio. That is, that all of the labor honchos in charge of getting out the vote reported that they were able to do so. That may be one reason that Jimmy Carter is smiling. We'll know a little bit more later on.
Thompson isn't taking Cook County. He's just running strongly there.
That's right. It's too early for us to say whether he is or isn't, but on the basis of what we know, we certainly wouldn't want to say that he's taking Cook County, but just compared with other elections, on the basis of these very early returns, Thompson is running exceptionally strong in the city of Chicago and in those suburban areas.
What kind of margin does the Democrat have to come out of Cook County now these days? What do they calculate in this election, for instance, to balance downstate Republican area?
Well, it depends on whom you talk to, but certainly anything less than 65% for a Democrat coming out of the city of Chicago. Just as a shot from horseback guess, would be considered bad news for a Democrat. Too early for us to tell how that's going to turn out, but I do think it's significant that Thompson, on the basis of these early returns, is showing so well inside Chicago.
We might also note that in Roger Mudd's territory, Florida and Virginia, that he's been telling us about and keeping an eye on, 6% of the votes in from Florida, and Carter has moved into a 55 to 44% lead there, and in Virginia with 5% in, Carter's in a 54 to 46% lead. That's with the tabulated vote so far in those states, and we'll get more from that from Roger in a little while. Right now, Eric Severide and Bill Moyers have some thoughts on the lack of third-party activities this year. Eric?
Yeah, this is really not a third-party year. We've had some real third parties in the past. The last real one was George Wallace. Many years ago, we had more serious ones. These are mostly one-issue splinter groups, prohibitionists, anti-abortion, and so on. McCarthy is the leading one, and he's not really, I wouldn't think, Bill, a third party. He's a kind of a one-man splinter, don't you think?
Sort of the third man.
Third man. On the basis of these very early returns, one could guess tentatively that he might get about 1 million votes overall nationally, which is not very much. Actually, the turnout for a third-party person or splinter is generally, it does turn out to be lower than their advance expectations. I don't know why exactly. I have a notion that a lot of protest votes like that just don't get cast because at the last minute people, knowing it won't affect things seriously, a lot of them don't go to the polls.
Yes, I'm surprised that the third parties don't do better than they do, simply because the Democratic and Republican parties basically represent a national consensus, and in a country with 220 million people, many of them as bizarre as we have in this country, you'd think that they would collect more effectively in third-party challenges.
Well, in a way, these third-party groupings are almost an integral part of a two-party system. They just seem to go along with it. I'm trying to think why they don't vote, and also who McCarthy would take votes from here. I don't think it's all from Jimmy Carter, do you?
No, but I think most of the disaffection that would go toward McCarthy would come from formerly liberal or left-leaning Democrats who feel Carter's a little bit too conservative and moderate for them.
But what I think I meant to suggest was that a lot of them are probably votes, wouldn't you think, that would not have been cast for either Ford or Carter.
I think they do represent the dissident, maverick quality in our political
And in that sense, if that's what it mostly is, I don't think he could spoil very much tonight.
What is interesting, that's right. He's certainly not going to hurt Carter in the South, where George Wallace hurt the Democrats so effectively in 1968. In fact, I'm impressed so far, Eric, with the fact that Carter has brought 3 states back into the Democratic column that voted for either Nixon or Wallace in both 1968 and 72. And if he goes on and wins Virginia, that'll be yet a 4th one. So you'd have to say in that part of the country, McCarthy is not hurting.
No, he says he runs on the platform that the two-party system bankrupt. He seems to be proving quite the opposite tonight. Now back to Walter Cronkite, the anchorman.
On the popular vote, 4% of the precincts have been counted to this hour, this very early hour, and Jimmy Carter is holding on to a narrow lead, 51 to 49%, as you see there. 1.25 million votes for Carter, just a little over 1 million, and we got a change right there. 1,216,470 for President Ford, 1,287 now for Carter. And those close contests in several states developing where the polls have closed and the count is taking place. As we said, in Florida, it's 54 to 45% now for Carter, with 7% of the vote in there. In Virginia, it's 54 to 46% for Carter, with 8% of the precincts in. South Carolina was looking close for a while, and now with some 1% or a little more than the vote in South Carolina, it's now 62 to 36% for Carter in that state. Polls are closing, of course, as the clock advances throughout these important eastern states. We've got the big electoral votes still to come in from major states, and they will tell us how the United States voted on this bright, sunny day over most of the United States, a day of decision for all of us. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night. From CBS News Election Headquarters in New York. This portion is sponsored by Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch is bullish on America. And now here again is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Polls are closing in a big block of states right at this hour, and a lot of election returns should be flooding in very shortly to our CBS News election headquarters here. So far, 4% of the nation's precincts have been counted, and Jimmy Carter is lengthening his lead just a bit over our last report over President Ford, but it's still very close. He has 52% to Ford's 48%, as you see here. Carter has about 1.5 million votes, Ford about 1.5 million, but the division is such that 52% to 48 for Carter, as you can tell by our board there. The electoral votes, and those are the ones that count, as you know. It's the Electoral College that casts its vote next month. That will determine actually who the next president is. 270 electoral votes needed. So far, according to our CBS News estimates, Carter has taken 3 states with a total of 30 electoral votes. Ford has taken 1 state with 13 electoral votes. That is Indiana for Ford. For Carter, it is Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia. These are all results that were expected. It was expected that Carter would take the states he has, and that Ford would very probably take Indiana. You could almost have predicted that those would be the results in those states. The really critical close states are yet to come in, and the polls in most of those are closing right now at 8 o'clock. There are some tight races in the South, as Roger Mudd has been reporting to us earlier this evening. Let's get a more detailed report from him now.
Walter, the South seems to have stabilized somewhat. Those earlier indications of softness in the Carter strength have shored up. And Florida, which now shows with 12% of the precincts in, Carter leading 54% of the popular vote, indicates that that ultimately will be a Carter state. President Ford, even in his strongest areas in Florida, in the central part of the state through the lake section and on the east and west coast, is running at under 50%. So the earlier estimate about Florida being a slightly inclined toward Carter appears to be holding. In South Carolina, the vote there shows that state leaning toward Jimmy Carter. The board show 12% of the precincts in, Carter leading with 63% of the vote. It appears that President Ford is doing well only in the northwest part of the state, which has shown Republican tendencies in the past. In every other area, the central part, down around Charleston, the coastal plain, Carter seems to be running at about 53 or 54%. So he's doing well in Florida and in South Carolina. In Virginia, however, there is an almost even split down the center. 12% of the precincts in, Carter leading by 51%, but our vote profile analysis shows that in almost every part of Virginia, around Richmond, in the Tidewater area, in the D.C. suburbs, the two men are dividing almost evenly, with Ford slightly ahead. So that was considered a Ford state, and perhaps will remain so according to the present indications. Virginia, therefore, would seem to be an isolated Ford state in the South, Walter.
According to our CBS News poll of voters leaving the polling booths, we have a CBS News estimate on that big gubernatorial race in Illinois, and according to our CBS News estimate, Jim Thompson will defeat Michael Howlett, the Democratic candidate, 61 to 39%. A very big victory for the Republicans in Illinois, taking the state house away from the Democrats. It had been held by Dan Walker down in Springfield, but he was defeated in a very bitter primary by Michael Howlett. Howlett has now gone down to defeat, and Big Jim Thompson has won in Illinois. We'll get the details of how he put together that victory from Dan Rather a little later on. According to our poll of people leaving the polling places, there is an interesting fact here that nearly all age groups are splitting evenly between Carter and Ford, except for one group, and that's the 22 to 29-year-olds, and they seem to be going rather overwhelmingly for Jimmy Carter. He seems to have corralled that part of the youth vote. Bruce Morton is the man who's really keeping track of these polls that we have taken. He's at our trend desk. But he's been watching just recently, particularly Jimmy Carter's attempt to reassemble the traditional Democratic coalition of voters. And Bruce, I wonder what your study has shown so far.
Well, Walter, there's a lot of movement back and forth. According to our sample, at any rate, Jimmy Carter has been able to reassemble some of that old Democratic coalition, but not all of it. Our interviewers asked voters, for instance, whom they'd supported in the primaries earlier this year. Of those who voted for Senator Henry Jackson in the Democratic primaries, Carter gets 3 out of 4, but only 3 out of 4. The other Jackson backers voted for Ford today. Of George Wallace's backers in the Democratic primaries, 2 out of 5 voted for President Ford. Of California Governor Jerry Brown's primary backers, almost a third voted, again, for President Ford. Carter, on the other hand, gets about a fourth of all the people who voted for Governor Ronald Reagan in the Republican primaries. In a lot of those Republican primaries, Reagan got higher marks in CBS News polls for leadership from the voters, higher marks than President Ford. But today, Ford runs ahead of Carter in our sample on being capable. Most of the conventional wisdom this year has been that the economy was the #1 issue. Wrong, according to the voters in our sample today. They said lopsidedly that restoring trust to government was the most important issue. Controlling inflation came second on the list of choices our interviewers offered them, but well behind. A distant second. Then after that, job guarantees, taxes, then foreign affairs, then Watergate and the Nixon pardon. And some things, Walter, just didn't matter very much to the voters in our sample. Few of them were affected by all those stories about investigations of President Ford's campaign finance records when he was in Congress. Few were affected by the charge that Mr. Ford wasn't very bright somehow. Few said they were bothered by Jimmy Carter's southernness, or his Playboy interview, or all the talk about his religion. And Mr. Ford's celebrated gaffe over who controlled Eastern Europe didn't seem to affect very many voters either. Walter?
Thank you, Bruce. 5% of the precincts counted across the nation now, and Carter holding on to that 52 to 48% lead. 1.75 million votes, a little over that. Ford, a little over 1.5 million votes. Now, Dan Rather, perhaps you can tell us, but let me hold you up just 1 minute on that, because in North Carolina, our CBS News estimate now is that Democrat James Hunt has won with 67% of the vote to Republican David Flaherty's 33% of the vote in that gubernatorial race in North Carolina. North Carolina goes back into its traditional Democratic posture. Holshouser, the incumbent governor, was a Republican, and Roger Mudd will tell us more about how that victory for the Democrats was put together when we come back to him a little later, but he's going to have to wait his turn, because I'm going to Dan Rather right now. He's going to tell us about the fascinating Illinois race, I assume.
Well, Walter, it is fascinating. For one thing, the Republicans have a bona fide new superstar on the national scene. He is James Big Jim Thompson, 6'6", 200-pound federal prosecutor who, according to our CBS News estimate, will be the new governor of Illinois. Let's take a look at the figures, and this is where it becomes fascinating. On the basis of our CBS News estimate, I'm sorry, this should be the tabulated vote. Thompson is running about 61% of the vote. On the basis of our CBS News estimate, this is with our sample precincts reporting, we think Thompson's final margin in Illinois will be on the order of 61%. We've had some confusion with the boards, which is my fault, but to tell you that our CBS News estimate, to emphasize it, is that Thompson's final winning margin may be on the order of 61%. Now, that's over Michael Howlett, the hand-picked candidate of Chicago Mayor Richard Daley. While Thompson will, we think, no doubt, lose the city of Chicago, he did cut way in to what had been the traditionally overwhelmingly large margins of Daley-backed candidates in the city of Chicago. Thompson won the race mainly in the suburbs, where he ran 3-1 over his opposition. Now, among the people who may be watching the outcome of tonight's presidential race very closely will be James Thompson, because by winning this Illinois gubernatorial race, Thompson would have to figure, whether he wanted to or not, that if the Republicans lost this time, he, Thompson, might have a shot at the presidency in 1980, could have it at any rate. But if the Republicans should lose the presidential race, Thompson will have the biggest government in the country under Republican leadership. Now, what this may or may not mean in the presidential race is the important thing for the moment. In Illinois, at the moment, we do have very few figures in, not really enough to show you anything on the boards. However, the Illinois race shapes up to be very, very close. And if Thompson's winning margin is anything approaching what our CBS News estimate indicates it may be, 61%, President Ford figures to benefit. It could be critical for him in Illinois. One thing, a footnote on James Thompson, the man who apparently has won that Illinois gubernatorial race. He likes to come on as a tough street person up from the west side, says things such as, "I saw my first opera only 10 or 15 days ago." But the fact of the matter is he ran a very well-organized campaign, exceptionally well-financed, among others W. Clement Stone and Ray Kroc, former financial backers of Richard Nixon, poured money into the campaign. The traditional fat cats and hired guns of the Republican Party, in political terms in Illinois, have tabbed James Thompson as a comer, and, Walter, they've tabbed him correctly. It could mean the difference for Gerald Ford in Illinois. By the way, Walter, we still don't know enough in Ohio to say anything with definition, except that the Ohio race, both in terms of the presidential campaign and in that Taft-Metzenbond Senate race, looks very, very close at this hour.
CBS News estimate does have a winner in South Carolina, Jimmy Carter, as expected, taking that southern state from Gerald Ford. We think when all the votes are counted, it'll be around 57 to 43% for Carter in South Carolina. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. CBS News can now estimate in the state of West Virginia that Jimmy Carter, as expected, has carried that state against President Ford. We have no percentages quite yet as to what our estimate will eventually show there. We'll give them to you shortly. So now it looks like this across the country, not only the presidential, but the Senate, House, and gubernatorial races. 5% of the presidential precincts have been counted so far, and Carter has lengthened his lead another percentage point over our last figure. He now has a 53 to 47% lead. Over 2 million votes for him, 1,832,000 odd for President Ford. Now that adds up to electoral votes. Those are the important ones. 270 are needed, you know, of 44. I think we haven't posted our last state to be called. That's West Virginia on there, which will bring that to 44 for Carter and some 13 for Ford. Ford's only state that he has won, as you can see on our map here, is Indiana with 13 electoral votes. Carter has won in the South, as expected, in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and West Virginia, as you can also see on the map, if we wish to post it there for you, and in Kentucky. That's a total of 44 electoral votes for Carter in those states. Now, in the Senate races, there are 33 seats up this year, as you know. 22 of those have been occupied by Democrats and 11 by Republicans. Well, so far, the Democrats have won 4 in states that they had anticipated winning in. 2, as a matter of fact, with no opposition in Mississippi and in West Virginia. They've also won in Florida and Virginia. But the Republicans have won in 1, taking a seat away from the Democrats. That is 1 term turnover seat so far for the Republicans. That's Richard Lugar in Indiana, who defeated Vance Hartke, who had been in the Senate for 12 years and now has been retired by Lugar in Indiana. A gain of one state so far for the Republicans. The Republicans do not anticipate, indeed almost cannot mathematically gain control of the Senate in this election with only 22 seats to go against, and many of those almost certain for the Democrats, but they would like to cut down the Democratic margin in the Senate, which is now 62 Democrats to 38 Republicans. In the gubernatorial races, 14 state houses are up this year. Of those, 8 are held by Democrats and 6 Republicans at the moment. And so far, 3 races have been decided. The Republicans have taken 2 of those seats, and the Democrats 1. The Republican victories came in Indiana and in Illinois taking a seat away from the Democrats, and in North Carolina, where the Democrats took a seat away from the Republicans. So far as changing anything goes, the Republicans and the Democrats have balanced out in the first 3 races decided in the gubernatorial contest. In the House of Representatives, the returns on those races come in quite slowly across the nation, and so far there aren't many decided as yet. There are 435. All of the seats in the House are up this year. As you know, the Democrats have a large margin in the House, 290 to 145, and the 94th Congress. And now, so far, the Republicans have won 16 seats and the Democrats 62. That's not very many yet, but it shows a trend toward the Democrats, and the Republicans had very little hope of changing the balance of power in the House, even as in the Senate, but they hoped at least to cut down on the Democratic margin. Now the polls are closing in some important eastern states. Perhaps Mike Wallace can give us a quick rundown of how they're going. Mike?
Well, I can give you a quick rundown on West Virginia, where incidentally today, Walter, the turnout was down by 4%, surprisingly. In West Virginia, as you pointed out, the winner, Jimmy Carter over Gerald Ford. Let's take a look at the tabulated vote with 6% of the precincts reporting. As you can see, Carter over Ford 61% to 39%. The CBS News estimate is that when it's all over, we don't know exactly how many votes Jimmy Carter will have, but it will be something of the order of 60%.
Mike,
yes,
may I interrupt you just one moment, because that important state of North Carolina, where it was wondered whether Ford had made a great last surge and might take the state, according to our CBS News estimate, he will not. And Jimmy Carter, according to our estimate, will win North Carolina when all the votes are counted by a percentage that will be somewhat smaller than this actually tabulated vote. With 5% of the vote in, you see Carter had 59%, but when all the votes are counted, we believe it'll be Carter 56 to 44% in North Carolina. Mike?
Back up north to West Virginia in the senatorial race there, no contest. Robert Byrd, unopposed for his 4th term in the Senate. At this moment, according to the CBS News estimate, he's going to win with 99% of the vote. I don't know where that other 1% is going. Robert Byrd returned to the Senate for the 4th term. Of course, he is currently the majority whip. He wants very much to move up from Senate majority whip to Senate majority leader to replace the retiring Mike Mansfield of Montana, and the chances are good he'll do that. There is an interesting battle for governor going on in the state of West Virginia, and it begins to look as though we're going to have another Rockefeller. Another Rockefeller occupying a governor's chair. 7% of the precincts in West Virginia are reporting John D. Rockefeller IV, J. Rockefeller, at this moment has 66% of the vote over his challenger, former governor Cecil Underwood. And at this moment, it begins to look as though it's going to be virtually 2-1 for J. Rockefeller in West Virginia. He went to West Virginia, young J. Rockefeller did. His 2 uncles, Winthrop and Nelson, were Republican governors. He went there to West Virginia about 13 years ago as a poverty worker, worked his way up through the House of Delegates, Secretary of State, West Virginia, tried for the governorship 4 years ago, didn't make it. Now he's decided that there doesn't need to be a law for gun controls. He doesn't want to ban strip mining anymore. He wants to reclaim strip mined area. He began to talk and think like a West Virginian, and he spent $3 million on this campaign. It comes out to something short of $3 per voter, the state of West Virginia, but apparently it is going to pay off at this moment, as you can see. 66% of that vote for Jay Rockefeller, 34% of that vote for Cecil Underwood in the state of West Virginia, Walter.
As reporting a moment ago on the House and the Senate races, it might be noted that in the Senate, the Republicans need a net of 13 Democratic seats. They need to win 13 of those 22 Democratic seats that are up this year in order to gain control of the Senate. That obviously is not very likely. Many of those seats, most of those seats are considered safe seats. There are only 2 or 3 Democratic seats that really are considered a toss-up tonight. We've heard from one of those that the Republicans have won already in Indiana. There are other seats that are in some jeopardy. We'll hear about that later, only a couple of them. But the Republicans need 13 net gain. Now, that has been done before. It's not impossible. It happened in Eisenhower's midterm back in 1958 that the Republicans won that many seats from the Democrats, but it doesn't seem likely this year. Now, in the House of Representatives, the Republicans need a net gain of 72 Democratic seats for control of the House. Now, that's been done 7 times before. The last time as recently as 1948 when Harry Truman won the presidency in a campaign against the Republican 80th Congress, as you'll remember. We can now estimate that in the District of Columbia, no surprise here, Jimmy Carter will win and win that district's 3 electoral votes. And no percentages available yet. No surprise at all that Carter has won heavily Democratic, the District of Columbia. We'll be along a little later now with some recapitulation of all of these returns and some interesting close races now developing. This is Walter Cronkite at our CBS News election headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night from CBS News election headquarters in New York. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
That heavy turnout of vote across the United States on this election day, or bicentennial election day, with 8% of the precincts counted, has given Jimmy Carter, the challenger from Plains, Georgia, an early lead of 53% over 47% for President Ford. Carter with over 3 million votes, Ford with 2 3/4 million votes. In the electoral vote, which is the one that counts, 270 needed, you know, Carter now has 70 electoral votes to Ford's 13 electoral votes. According to our CBS News estimate of the winner in those states, Carter's states and Ford's states show about like this on our map. Ford has won 1 state of Indiana with 13 electoral votes, according to our CBS News estimate, and our estimate believes that Carter has won in the South. Primarily has taken the states of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, the District of Columbia, West Virginia, and Kentucky for a total of 70 electoral votes. And let's take a look now at where the races are developing in the various states across the nation. For the states that we have not been able to call yet, let's go first to the east with Mike Wallace. Mike?
Walter, a fascinating race shaping up in the east in Connecticut. 9% of the precincts are now reporting in Connecticut. And Gerald Ford, at this moment, as you can see, is losing by about 1,000 votes to Jimmy Carter. The CBS News estimate, however, has Ford leading in Connecticut 53% to 47%. If Ford were to win in Connecticut, that would be a very big win for him. Let me repeat once again. According to what we have right now, Carter is leading Ford 50 to 49% in the tabulated vote with 9% of the precincts reporting. But the CBS News estimate is that actually Jerry Ford is leading 53% to 47% in the state of Connecticut. Another interesting one, in Maryland, now 4% of the precincts are reporting in Maryland. Jimmy Carter leading Jerry Ford there, leading President Ford there, 52% to 48%. Incidentally, for just a moment, if we can come on back to Connecticut, The CBS News estimate is now that Lowell Weicker has been returned to the Senate of the United States against his Democratic challenger, Gloria Schaefer. Lowell Weicker returned for another term in the U.S. Senate, the maverick Republican who thought for a while that he toyed with the notion of running as an independent, decided to stay with the Republican Party. Richard Nixon's, perhaps his chief critic on the Watergate Committee. 60% of the vote is the CBS News estimate of what he will wind up with. As you can see at this moment, with 10% of the precincts reporting, he has 57% of that vote. Let's move along to New Hampshire, where 6% of the precincts are reporting. There's a tough race going on there. It was expected that Jerry Ford would carry that state rather comfortably, with 6% of the precincts reporting. As you can see, Jimmy Carter is ahead of President Ford, 50 to 49%. To New Jersey now, with 11% of the precincts reporting. Ford carrying 52 to 46. Yes.
May I interrupt you just a moment? We've got a very important CBS News estimate in a major state, the state of Texas, with 26 big electoral votes, believed to be a very close battleground between Carter and Ford. And our CBS News estimate is that Carter has won Texas, and that when all the votes are counted, while right now only 3% of the votes have been counted and Carter leads 55 to 45, his final total will be somewhat a little less than that, and he'll win with about 53 to 46% of the vote. 26 electoral votes dropping into Jimmy Carter's pocket, important votes that he had been counting on to make his majority tonight, but which looked like it was up for grabs. Mike?
Back to New Jersey for just a second. 17 electoral votes there, vital for Gerald Ford to carry that state if he hopes to carry the country. With 11% of the precincts reporting, as you can see, he is ahead 52 to 46. However, the CBS News estimate is that there is no trend at this moment. And finally, in the East, with 2% of the precincts reporting in the state of Pennsylvania, you can see it's a very tight race. Gerald Ford leading Jimmy Carter there, 50% to 48%. So the East is going to go on counting votes for a long, long time, and neither Gerald Ford nor Jimmy Carter have much of an advantage either way in those vital eastern states right now, Walter.
A moment ago, I believe, Mike, that I did not officially report for us that Tennessee is also a Carter state. We showed it on our Carter map a moment ago, but didn't give you the actual estimate, our CBS News estimate, that is that Carter will win in Tennessee. He should take it by about 55 to 44% of the vote. That's 10 electoral votes from Tennessee for Carter, whose total is now 96 electoral votes. Now, let's find out more about the South and other close races there from Roger Mudd. Roger?
Walter, with Texas now a Carter state, with Tennessee a Carter state, it appears that those danger signals that we talked about earlier from Kentucky have been pulled down, and it appears that, with one or two exceptions at least, the South will be solid for Jimmy Carter. We still have some outstanding races where the voting is too close to call or there is no established trend. Take a look at Virginia. There, with more than a third of the precincts in, President Ford is leading Carter 51-49. It appears that Jimmy Carter is staying in that race because of a large turnout by the black voters in Virginia, who are supporting Carter in proportions of about 9 to 1. In every other part of Virginia, Ford is leading. In the D.C. suburbs, in the Richmond, Tidewater area, in the West, Ford is ahead of Jimmy Carter. The Republican tradition is growing in Virginia, at least on the presidential level. So we have no established trend there. That does look like a Ford state. The other close race in the South is in Florida. There, with just under a third of the vote in, Carter is leading in the popular vote, 54% to Ford's 45%, but our CBS News vote profiles indicate that there is no established trend in Florida. So that means with Texas in the Carter camp, that would indicate that Louisiana, which had been thought perhaps it would go for Ford, may stay with Carter, and Carter can come out of the South losing perhaps only Virginia and Florida.
What about the Middle West, Dan?
Walter, it's cardiac arrest time in the Middle West. 3 heart-stopping finishes in the presidential races. First, let's take a look at Ohio. This is the tabulated vote. 4% of the tabulated vote in, Ford leading Carter 53% to 45%. We don't have enough of our sample precincts reporting yet to have any estimate in that race. It does appear that it's going to be very, very close, and Ohio could keep us up into the wee hours of the morning with a decision. Any prediction right now, though, would be about as out of place as a tarantula on a wedding cake. In Illinois, in the presidential race, keep in mind that the Republicans already have captured a gubernatorial election in Illinois, and that may help Gerald Ford there. This is the actual tabulated vote, only 1% of the vote in, and Carter running 59%. This is in Illinois, not enough of that vote in, again, to make any kind of prediction. It simply indicates how very, very close the race for Illinois' 26 electoral votes may be. And keep in mind that over the last half century, Illinois has been the best barometer in the nation on presidential races. Now, in Missouri, still another very, very close race shaping up. 5% of the actual vote in and tabulated. Carter, 55% of the vote. Missouri used to be one of those states that was called a bellwether, but not in recent elections. It's gone back and forth. 12 electoral votes at stake here. The Carter forces have their hopes very high in Missouri, mostly because of Missouri's border state reputation, having some tie with the Deep South, feeling that Carter's fundamentalist religion would help him in Missouri. However, two Republican candidates running very strong in Missouri, Christopher Kit Bond, the gubernatorial candidate, and Dan Forth, the senatorial candidate, could be the coattail difference for Gerald Ford, but again, too early to say. Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri, all very, very close at this hour in the presidential race.
Dan, I'd like to come back and ask you about Michigan in a minute, but first of all, we have an important call in Connecticut. Our CBS News estimate for the state of Connecticut is that President Ford will win that important swing state of Connecticut. That right now the vote in Connecticut is showing about this percentage, or a little lower than that, but Ford, when all the votes are in, we think we'll get 53% to 47% for Carter, 8 electoral votes falling to President Ford, and that is the second state tonight after Indiana that CBS News has been able to estimate will be in the Carter column. Now, Dan, about Michigan.
Walter, again, we simply don't have enough figures to make any kind of show on Michigan, either in the tabulated vote or in the estimate. But this much is becoming increasingly certain in the Midwest, Walter, that with Jimmy Carter running as strong in the South, generally speaking, as he had hoped, the pressure has been increased on Gerald Ford to carry the big Midwestern states, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan. He's already carried Indiana. As the minutes go by and the Carter lead in the South continues to build, it becomes increasingly apparent that Gerald Ford will need his home state, and it's another one of those that's shaping up to be very, very close.
On the popular vote, we're getting up toward 10% of the vote in now, and Carter has dropped 1 percentage point back from where he was in our last report. He's now at 52% to 47% for Ford. Ford has not come up, but Gene McCarthy has got that other percentage of the vote. Carter 52 to Ford's 47%. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. In the state of Maryland, CBS News estimates that in the Senate race there, the challenger Democrat Paul Sarbanes has defeated the incumbent Republican J. Glenn Bell. The percentage of the victory for Sarbanes, when all the votes are counted, we believe will be about like that, 59 to 36% of the vote for Sarbanes. And a call in the state of Kansas. It's hardly a surprise that President Ford, according to our CBS News estimate, will defeat Carter in Kansas by 52 to 46% of the vote. A rather narrow victory for President Ford in Kansas, the home state of his running mate Robert Dole. But Kansas is safely now in the Ford column. So now with some 10% of the national vote in, Carter is still holding on to his 52 to 47% lead. With some 8 million of the nation's votes counted, 4 million for Carter, 3 3/4 million for President Ford. In those Senate races, we can now take a look at what has been developing there. 33 Senate races are up this year, as you know, and so far Democrats have been elected in 7 states, none of them surprises, all incumbents. Republicans have been elected in 2 states, and in both of those states they have taken seats away from the Democrats. Those are in the states of Indiana, where Richard Lugar defeated the incumbent Vance Hartke, and in Maryland, where we were just able to say on the basis of our CBS News estimate that Paul Sarbanes ousted the incumbent Republican J. Glenn Bell. In the gubernatorial races, 3 races have been decided so far of the 14 up tonight, and the Republicans have taken 2 of those state houses. The Democrats have taken 1. The Republicans have ousted the Democrats the Republican ousted the Democrat, I should say, in Illinois, where Jim Thompson defeated Michael Howlett for a seat that had been held by Democrat Dan Walker before he lost in the primary. And in North Carolina, Hunt has won the seat for the Democrats that had been held the last couple of years by Republican Governor Holshouser. Now let's go back to Eric Sevareid and Bill Moyers, and I think they're going to tell us something about that split between the electoral and the popular vote, which always intrigues us on any election night.
Well, Walter, at all these national election banquets, there are some statistical ghosts that people worry about. The most usual one is the idea of neither candidate getting an electoral college majority, throwing it into the House of Representatives. But that happens when you have strong third parties that take 1 or more states. No chance of that this year. The second ghost is the idea of an even split between the 2 candidates in electoral votes, each one getting 269 electoral votes. That seems highly unlikely. But the third one might have some element of reality to it tonight, though it's probably doubtful. And that is the idea of one of the men, the 2 major candidates, getting a popular vote majority, but an electoral college vote minority. Bill, can you imagine that? It would raise hell, wouldn't it, with the country, if that happened?
It would certainly make the electoral college heretofore relatively unnoticed as far as significant change in our society, the object of much speculation and a great deal of wooing. It happened once, you remember, not to remember personally, Eric, but I'm sure from reading history, you know that in 1888, in terms much like the developments tonight, Grover Cleveland won a whopping plurality in the South, but lost by a few votes in the major states in the North and the Midwest. And although he got more popular votes, he lost the electoral college vote and he lost the White House.
He didn't challenge it, though.
No, he didn't challenge it. In fact, I was talking on the phone a few minutes ago to Walter Dean Burnham, who's a professor of political science at MIT and one of the most astute observers of our political antics, and he was saying that in the 19th century, there were very few challenges to very close elections.
Well, as I remember that story from the books, Benjamin Harrison, who won, said later, "Providence gave us the victory." What gave them the victory was a lot of corruption. They bought votes in Indiana, and they made a deal with Tammany Hall in New York. Of course, Tammany Hall didn't like that reformer Cleveland. That's where he got it, but nobody protested the thing. There is the possibility, of course, that individual electors could switch because they're not all bound by law, as far as I know. There have been some switches, 5 in the since 48 up to the election of 72, but only 1 man each time, and didn't have much effect.
And as Professor Burnham has pointed out, if the electoral vote is close and the Carter people prefer Ford, there's no legal reason why these electors couldn't vote for them. We'll see how faithless an elector could be in a situation like that.
If that wild thing should happen tonight, it's going to be a great test of our belief in the principle of federalism. Well, now we'll get it back to Walter Cronkite, the anchor.
In 3 of the big electoral states that it is considered the winner tonight is going to have to do well and perhaps take, the vote right at this moment looks like this. In Pennsylvania, Ford is leading with 51 to 47% of the vote. In Ohio with 6%, and Pennsylvania 51 to 47 Ford. In Ohio with 6% of the vote in, Ford is leading with 51% of the vote. In Michigan with 4% of the vote in, though, in Ford's home state, Carter has jumped into quite a long early lead, 59 to 40%. It's not anticipated he'll hold on to that much of a lead in Michigan, but it indicates that it is going to be close in the president's home state. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. We have two Senate races decided according to our CBS News estimate based on our sample precincts in the two states involved. One is in the state of Missouri. There, in that Senate race, it was for the seat held by Stuart Symington for 4 terms. 24 years he spent in the United States Senate. He retired this year, and the seat has gone to a Republican. John Danforth has defeated the Democratic candidate, the former Governor Warren Hearns in Missouri. We believe that when all of the votes are counted there, it'll look about like this: 55% for John Danforth, now the Attorney General of the state, 45% for Warren Hearns. That was the seat that Jerry Litton, a congressman from the Kansas City and East District of Missouri, had won the Democratic nomination for, and flying to his victory celebration on the primary night was killed along with his entire family in a small plane crash. The other seat decided tonight, according to our CBS News estimate, is in Delaware, where Pete DuPont, the scion of the famous paint and chemical manufacturing firm, has defeated the Democratic incumbent Sherman Tribbles for not the incumbent, but yes, he is the incumbent, I'm sorry. That's for a gubernatorial seat. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused at the moment. In Delaware, let's start from scratch. In the gubernatorial race in Delaware, Pete DuPont has defeated the incumbent Sherman Tribbles. And the percentage, by the time it is all over, according to our CBS News estimate, is that DuPont's victory will be 57 to 43%. So another Senate seat has been taken from the Democrats. That's the third tonight from the Republicans, and a gubernatorial seat has gone to the Republicans as well. This is CBS News, and Walter Cronkite reporting. We'll be back shortly.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night from CBS News election headquarters in New York. This portion is sponsored by the American Bankers Association, your bank helping you change things for the better. And now here again is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening again from our election headquarters, and here are 3 CBS News estimates of races in 3 states. A senatorial race from the state of Massachusetts. Hardly any surprise that our CBS News estimate is able to say that in Massachusetts, the incumbent Senator Edward Kennedy has won a re-election there. We don't have any figures on that yet, but that was a almost foregone conclusion in Massachusetts. 2 gubernatorial contests have been decided. One had been believed to be very close, and that's in the state of New Hampshire, where, according to our CBS News estimate, Republican Governor Meldrum Thompson has beaten off a challenge from Harry Spanos. 37 to 43%, we believe the final figures will be when they are all tabulated in New Hampshire. And in West Virginia, John J. Rockefeller has apparently won the race in West Virginia for the State House. He was turned back on a previous challenge for that position, but has won it this time. Our CBS News estimate indicates he has won it overwhelmingly, 2-1, 66% over Cecil Underwood, former governor, who was trying for a comeback in West Virginia. That is a seat that had been held by Republican Arch Moore, and now goes to the Democrats. Our national recapitulation now, almost 15% of the vote is in across the United States. 14% of the precincts counted, and the percentage lead of Jimmy Carter holds just about steady, 52 to 47% for Jerry Ford. Carter has over 6 million votes now. Carter a little over 5.5 million votes. Those break down in the important electoral college this way. 270 votes are needed, you know, and Carter now has accumulated 96, and Ford has got 28 electoral votes. They come from the following states. Ford's 28 electoral votes come from Indiana, And from Connecticut, 13 in Indiana, 8 in Connecticut, for a total of 26. And in Carter's case, he wins his votes from Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, West Virginia, North Carolina, District of Columbia, Tennessee, and Texas. Texas having been something of a surprise. It was believed to be a toss-up state. It went in fairly good margin, according to our CBS News estimate, to Jimmy Carter. In the Senate races, 33 races up, as you know, this year. 22 of those were held by Democrats, 11 by Republicans. So far, the Democrats have won in 8 states, the Republicans in 4. The important question is, how many Democratic seats can the Republicans take away from the Democrats, and vice versa? And that shows as follows. The Republicans have taken 2 seats away from the Democrats. The Democrats 1 from the Republicans. The Republican victories have come in Indiana and in Missouri, and the Democratic victory in Maryland, taking away seats from sitting senators from those states. The gubernatorial races, 14 state houses are up this year, 8 Democratic, 6 Republican, and so far 7 of those races have been decided according to our CBS News estimate, the Republicans having won 4, the Democrats 3, and each party has taken 2 seats from the other. The Republicans have taken seats in Illinois and in Delaware that have been held by Democrats. The Democrats have taken seats in North Carolina and West Virginia that had been held by the Republicans. In the House races, but I'll give you that in just a moment. Let me first say that our CBS News estimate is in from the state of Arkansas, and no surprise there, Jimmy Carter has defeated Ford as expected. In the state of Arkansas, no percentages yet on that race. In the House of Representatives, we now have decisions from over almost 200 seats. Republicans have won 46, the Democrats 117. The Republicans are hoping to take some 76 seats from the Democrats to gain control of the House. They were hoping it, but not with very great expectations, and it is not likely that they will win that many. Even the Republicans themselves don't anticipate that tonight. From New Hampshire, our CBS News estimate now is that New Hampshire, as had been expected, will go to President Ford. That he will win in New Hampshire when all the votes are tabulated there by about 57 to 43% for 4 more electoral votes in New Hampshire. Now Bruce Morton has the latest information from our CBS News poll. Bruce?
Walter, our sample's getting fatter. Our interviewers across the country now have talked to some 10,600 voters as they're leaving the polls, and we have a number of breakdowns as to how this race is going among different kinds of voters. We show President Ford ahead among white Protestants, 56 to 43, trailing among Catholics, 45 to 54, and among Jews, 29 to 70. Overall, white voters are pretty evenly divided in our sample so far, but black voters lopsidedly prefer Carter, 82 to 18. The different age groups all seem to divide pretty evenly, except that Carter is leading among the young voters, those in their 20s. Carter leads among city dwellers, as Democrats traditionally do, is even with Ford among suburbanites, and that's normally Republican territory. The president leads in farm areas. Carter leads among blue-collar workers, as you might expect, and in one other vital constituency, those voters who call themselves independents, Ford and Carter are running dead even. That's bad news for the president because Republicans, being a minority party, need independent support in order to win. Our sample, Walter, shows Eugene McCarthy with roughly 1% of the vote. He seems to be getting it mostly from those voters who say they're independents. So you could argue that McCarthy may be hurting Ford and helping Carter. Walter?
Thank you, Bruce. The total now, I think I did not call all of the states that Ford won a moment ago. He has won in Indiana, Connecticut, Kansas, and as New Hampshire, as we called just a moment ago. So his total in the Electoral College vote is 32, with 102 for Carter. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. The are very tight presidential races in several of the states developing. We'll have reports on those very shortly. There are also some very tight ones for the Senate and the gubernatorial contest. Let's take a quick look at those now. First from the east with Mike Wallace. Mike?
Edmund Muskie. Walter, Edmund Muskie, according to the CBS News estimate, will be returned to the Senate of the United States for his 4th term. Let's take a look at the tabulated vote. Only 3% of those precincts now reporting in Maine. Muskie leading 56% to 44% over challenger Robert Monks. We don't have an actual estimate as to where that's going to wind up, but in the past, Ed Muskie has never wound up with less than 61% of the vote. He's had a closer race this time, but he has been returned, apparently, according to the CBS News estimate, to the Senate of the United States. In New Jersey, Senator Harrison Williams, also in the Senate for 18 years, has been returned to office over his challenger, young David Norcross. Nobody else really wanted to run against Pete Williams in New Jersey, and as you can see, with 35% of the precincts reporting, Williams has 59% of the vote. The estimate is that when all of the votes are counted in New Jersey, Harrison Williams will have been returned to office with 61% of the vote over young David Norcross. Now, if it weren't for the glow given off by big money, you couldn't tell John Hines and William Green one from the other in a dimly lighted room. These are two men who are running for the Senate in the state of Pennsylvania. Each is tall, dark, good-looking, 38 years old, a congressman with an attractive wife, 3 children. 15% of the precincts are reporting in Pennsylvania, and as you can see at this moment, it looks as though the money, the big money, John Hines is leading, 53% to 47%. However, the CBS News estimate is that there is really no trend in Pennsylvania. That race is still a very, very close race. Hines was the heir to the pickles and ketchup fortune of his family. He left a safe House seat to run for the Senate vacancy created by the retiring Hugh Scott. Democrat Bill Green left a safe seat that he inherited after the death of his congressman father back in 1964. He's won that seat 5 times on his own. Green has spent $75,000 of his own money. Altogether, he has spent $888,000 in that race. Hines has spent almost $2.25 million of his own money and has spent something over $2.5 million in that race. It comes to something like 40 cents a voter, and I would imagine it would be an hour or two before we find out which money won. Walter?
Our CBS News estimate is able to make a call in Tennessee. Roger Mudd can tell us about it. Roger?
Walter, the Tennessee Senate race was really the only spirited Senate race we had in the South. The incumbent William Brock, going for his 2nd full term, has now been defeated by none other than the former Democratic State Chairman, Jim Sasser. Our tabulated vote board shows with over half the precincts in, James Sasser 54%, William Brock 46%. The CBS News estimate shows Sasser the winner, 53% to Brock's 47% when all those votes are counted. Senator Brock said from the beginning, my big problem in Tennessee is not James Sasser, it's Jimmy Carter, and that's exactly what happened. Jim Sasser got in on Jimmy Carter's coattails. Carter carried that state by about 56%, and our percentages this evening show Sasser carrying it about 53%. He trailed Carter by 3 or 4 percentage points in every part of the state. There are other Senate seats in the South. Walter, in Florida, Lawton Childs is the winner. In Mississippi, John Stennis has been reelected. In Texas, Lloyd Benson has been reelected, defeating Alan Steelman, a congressman from Dallas. And in Virginia, the independent, Harry Byrd, has defeated the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Elmo Zumwalt, and he whooped him, 62%.
How about the Middle West, Stan?
Well, Walter, in Nebraska, a very solid win for Gerald Ford. Nebraska, one of the most Republican states in the country, except for 1964. It's gone Republican for the past 40 years. In Douglas County, including Omaha, President Ford ran about 55 to 43% ahead of Jimmy Carter. It had been thought that Mr. Ford might be in trouble among Nebraska farmers for last year's grain sales embargo, but that is not the case, and our CBS News estimate is that President Ford has won Nebraska by about a margin of 59%. Now, one of the real upsets of the evening could be in the making in Missouri. Certainly already it's an upset in the fact that the race is so close, a squeaker in the gubernatorial race in Missouri. This is the battle between the incumbent Republican governor, Christopher Kit Bond, 38 years old, bidding to become one of the Republican superstars from the Midwest. The question was supposed to be not if Bond would win, but by how much. Lo and behold, walking Joe Teasdale, former prosecuting attorney from Kansas City, with 28% of the vote in and tabulated, leads Kit Bond 53% to 47%. There's a race we'll be watching, because while the Republicans have already elected a senator in Missouri, John Danforth picking up the seat that did belong to the Democrats, and Stuart Symington retiring, while Danforth has won in Missouri, Kit Bond locked in a very tight race. For Missouri's 12 electoral votes, that could prove to be good news for Jimmy Carter. We'll simply have to wait and see. In Ohio, in the Senate race that could have an effect on the presidential race, Metzenbaum and Taft. Here's what with 15% of the vote in, the tabulated vote shows Howard Metzenbaum with leading Robert Taft, the incumbent Republican senator, 51% to 49%. There's one that we are likely to be watching all evening long. Now, we're told that Metzenbaum has done particularly well in and around Cleveland, getting better than 60% of the vote there. If that holds up for Jimmy Carter in the presidential race, could be good news for him in Ohio. In Michigan, Senate race there that could also have some effect on the presidential race. In the Michigan Senate race, Donald Regan, the congressman, used to be a Republican, switched over to the Democratic column to make this race with a surprisingly large lead over Marvin Esch, his Republican opponent for the Senate seat that it was left open by the retirement of Philip Hart. This is on the basis of the tabulated vote, 10% of the tabulated vote in Michigan. But on our CBS News estimate, we estimate that Regal has jumped out to a significant lead on the order of 54 to 46%. But although it's a significant lead, we are not yet prepared to say that Regal wins that race. We are prepared to say that he's jumped out to a sizable lead. Could, again, be good news for Jimmy Carter in Michigan if Regal's lead holds up. Walter, one other point that we didn't get a chance to make earlier, that in carrying Kansas, President Ford's margin was not as impressive as some people thought it might be, considering Kansas's reputation as a very strong Republican state. But in the Midwest, Nebraska goes to Ford, Kansas has gone to Ford, Indiana has gone to Ford, very tight gubernatorial race in Missouri, very tight Senate races in Michigan and Ohio.
We can now say on the basis of our CBS News estimate of our sample precincts that in Massachusetts, Jimmy Carter will win that important state. Not too much of a surprise there. Already Senator Kennedy had won his Senate race overwhelmingly in Massachusetts. We have no estimated percentages yet for Massachusetts, but it is going into the Carter column according to our calculations here. A short while ago, Democratic National Chairman Roger Strauss talked to reporters about tonight's returns.
I want you to know that we've been checking all over the country. There are no surprises. We're winning some states, we're losing some states. But I do want you to know that we haven't lost one single state that we expected to carry. We have carried a couple that we thought we might lose. So things are looking good, and there's nothing new on Ohio, but we've been checking around with all of our people out there, and they say Ohio is going to fall in the Democratic column. And if it does, it'll follow the great state of Texas, I might add, which is already done so. And so all I want to say to you is I think we're in for a happy night. I think we're going to have a modestly long night. But these states, Michigan, for example, is too close to call, but that's the president's home state. Now, our candidate's home state went 75-25 for him.
That's Robert Strauss, not Roger Strauss, as I said. It's Robert Mudd I was thinking of. In the state of New York, in the Senate race in New York, CBS News has an estimate that Patrick Moynihan, former UN ambassador, will defeat John Buckley in New York State, has defeated him, and that the final percentage will show about 55% for Moynihan to 45% for Buckley, who spent one term in the Senate after having been elected on the conservative ticket in a split vote situation here 6 years ago. Moynihan is now taking that seat for the Democrats. There are some very close races for the presidency across the nation, as Robert or Roger Strauss said a moment ago. A rundown of those in Illinois, for instance. With 4% of the vote in, Carter has only a 56 to 43% lead. In Michigan, with 9% of the vote in, Carter leads 57 to 42. In Missouri, 25% of the vote in, Carter leading 55 to 44. Ohio, 15% of the vote in, and it's an even split at this moment, 49 and 49% for each of the men. Delaware, 63% in, Carter leading with 52%. Maine, only 3% in, and Carter has a narrow lead of 51% in Maine. In Maryland, a third of the vote, 37% counted, and it's 50-50 there. In New Jersey, 37% counted, and Ford has a rather wide lead of 53 to 46 for that state's big 17 electoral vote block. New York, there's not even a full 1% in New York as yet. In Pennsylvania, 17% of the vote has been counted, and Ford has a 50 to 48% lead in Pennsylvania. With 18% of the nation's precincts counted now, Carter is holding on to his 52% lead. He has 8,228,000 votes to Ford's 7.5 million votes. And electoral votes, that breaks down 37 for Ford and 116 for Carter. Ford has taken 5 states so far: Indiana, Connecticut, Kansas, New Hampshire, and Nebraska. And Carter has taken Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, West Virginia, North Carolina, the District of Columbia, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, and Massachusetts. The entire Ford family, we're told, is watching the return. Comes in tonight in the White House. They've all gathered there for the occasion. Ford's running mate, Senator Robert Dole, and Mrs. Dole have joined the election night watch at the White House as well. And the other guests, as Bob Schieffer told us there a little while ago, include Joe Garagiola and some other members of the 6 members of the Garagiola family, and also on hand former Democratic Representative Edith Green, or Republican Representative Edith Green of Oregon, and Mrs. Green's son. We'll have more on these election returns as they come piling in now, as polls close in more and more states across the nation. And very shortly, some are going to be coming in from the West, and we may even at that time get a chance to hear from Leslie Stahl. So Leslie Stahl fans everywhere, wherever you are across these United States, please don't go away. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night. From CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, here again is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening again. And in the state of Delaware, we now have a CBS News estimate of the winner there in the presidential race. CBS News, on the basis of our sample precinct, can say that that race has been won by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter wins in Delaware. His percentage, when all the votes are counted there, about 54% to Ford's 45%. Another state in, Rhode Island. Our CBS News estimate is that Carter also will take Rhode Island, defeating the incumbent president there 56 to 44% in the normally Democratic state of Rhode Island. So with now a fifth of the nation's precincts reported, a little over 21% of them in. Jimmy Carter is holding on to his popular vote majority, 52 to 47%. He has 9.25 million votes to almost 8.5 million votes for President Ford. In the all-important electoral count, it breaks down to 37 for President Ford and 123 for the former governor of Georgia. Those come from these states. For Ford, 5 states are in his column, according to our CBS News estimate. In Connecticut is the biggest breakthrough for him so far, a state that was believed to be a toss-up and has frequently been a swing state. The others are in New Hampshire, returning to a Republican column again, and in the Middle West, Indiana, Kansas, and Nebraska. Carter's states are solidly from the South, as well as a couple of others, some important ones. For instance, Texas, with its big block of 26 electoral votes, which was believed to be a toss-up, has gone in his column. And his states are these: Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, West Virginia, North Carolina, the District of Columbia, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Massachusetts, and Delaware. In the Senate races, 33 up tonight, as you know. The Republicans have won 4 of those so far, the Democrats 11. The big question is who takes seats from the other party in the Senate, and the Republicans have taken 2 seats from the Democrats so far tonight. The Democrats 3 seats from the Republicans. The Republican gains have come in Indiana and in Missouri. The Democratic gains have come in Maryland, in Tennessee, and in the third state, which I'll have to look up for you here and haven't found yet, but I will. In the gubernatorial races, there are 14 states at stake tonight. The Republicans have won 4, the Democrats 3. The Republicans have gained 2 Democratic seats, and the Democrats have gained 2 Republican state houses. Those gains for the Democrats have come in West Virginia and in North Carolina. The Republicans have won formerly held seats held by the Democrats in Illinois and in Delaware. In the House races, all 435 seats are up, as you know, and the Democrats hold a big 76-vote margin in the present Congress. Well, tonight so far, the Republicans have won 58 of those 435 seats up, the Democrats 148 seats. Now let's get some details from the races in the East from Mike Wallace. Mike?
Walter, 85 electoral votes, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and we don't have a lot of votes in any of those 3 states, but let's take a look. Beginning with New York, all the polls have showed Carter way ahead. A month ago, they showed him winning New York City by something over 62%. Jewish voters, he was leading 72 to 13. Blacks, 88 to 4. 8% of the precincts are now reporting. And take a look at it. Gerald Ford leading 54 to 46%. But that's only 8% of the precincts reporting, and I'm sure that we're going to see a change in New York. Take a look now at New Jersey. In New Jersey, unemployment at over 11%. Labor working hard for Carter, but the Democrats split there, and this could be hurting Carter. The tabulated vote with 41% of the precincts now reporting. Gerald Ford, 53%. This is 17 electoral votes at stake here. Do we have a CBS News estimate in New Jersey? We do not. But Gerald Ford seems, anyway, to be building a fairly comfortable lead, an important lead for him in the state of New Jersey. And now let's take a look at the state of Pennsylvania. We have 1 out of 3 precincts finally reporting in Pennsylvania. 33% of that state has now been tabulated, and Gerald Ford is down 51 to 48% in that state. On paper, this should be a Carter state. It's gone Democratic in 3 out of the last 4 elections. Labor is strong and well organized in Pennsylvania. Carter had a good win in the primary here, and of course he wants that state very, very badly. The CBS News estimate in Pennsylvania. Carter leading with 51% of the vote, Ford 48, and that could be very, very important for Jimmy Carter if it holds up that way.
The Senate race, Mike, was your Senate race. Moynihan winning over Jim Buckley in New York State, which made the 3rd state that the Democrats have won from the Republicans.
Actually, Walter, in New York in that race, Jim Buckley did not do as well as people had expected. In the last polls, Pat Moynihan was only ahead about 4 points, but according to the CBS News estimate, he's going to wind up with 10 points, 55 to 45 over Jim Buckley, and we now have a winner in Rhode Island. Garrahy, the lieutenant governor in Rhode Island, four-time lieutenant governor, has defeated James Taft 58% to 42%, according to the CBS News estimate in the state of Rhode Island. No surprise there for this very popular Democrat, Joe Garrahy, to win the governorship and replace Phil Noel.
CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. Democrats have held on to a hard-fought Senate seat in Michigan, and Republicans have taken a seat from the Democrats in Rhode Island in the Senate. In Michigan, the result, according to our CBS News estimate, shows Donald Regal, the Democrat congressman, succeeding to the seat vacated by the retiring Senator Hart. He defeated Marvin Esch, the Republican candidate, and our final figures, we believe, will be about 54% for Regal, 46% for Esch. In the state of Rhode Island, the former Secretary of the Navy, Republican John Chafee, has won in Rhode Island over Richard Lorber, a political newcomer, for the seat being vacated by the retiring John Pastore. The final vote in Rhode Island, probably around 55 to 45% for Chafee. President Ford's following tonight's returns from the White House. Bob Schieffer's there. Bob?
Walter, this is not going to have any effect on the outcome of the election, but some sort of offbeat news. You know, we mentioned earlier that President Ford was having trouble with his voice. Well, we've now been told that the president has lost his voice entirely. He is simply unable to speak. An aide told me a while ago that he has no fever or any ill effects or anything like that, but his voice simply gave out after this marathon tour that he took over the last 10 days, where he made literally hundreds of speeches. So there's a real question now as to whether the president will be able to make a statement tonight. Whatever happens, he simply may be unable to talk. The aide who told me about it said that he sees no way the president can have anything to say tonight unless Dr. Lukash, the White House physician, is able to give him some sort of medicine. Also, Walter, just one note here. The outlook here right now is not entirely optimistic. Nobody is conceding defeat or anything of that sort, but nobody is going around saying we've got it in the bag so far. The closest one aide would say to that tonight was that, well, it's still doable. Walter?
We'll be coming back there, Bob, for reports later on this evening, of course. And now let's go to our southern regional correspondent, Roger Mudd. Roger?
Walter, it's obvious that whatever damage was done by the Playboy interview and by the GOP's success in picturing Jimmy Carter as a free-spending liberal has been outweighed by a huge turnout in the South, an enormous number of Southerners turning out to vote for a fellow Southerner, and a huge number of black voters turning out. We already, for instance, are able now to call in Louisiana, which was thought to be a state leaning toward Ford. We call that, according to our CBS News vote profile analysis, Louisiana goes to Jimmy Carter. That makes the 9th state out of the 13 in the South to go for Carter. You can take a look at the southern list of states and see what Carter has done. I'll give you the percentage by which CBS News estimates the Carter win. Alabama, 58%, Arkansas, 66%, Georgia, 69%, Kentucky, 52%, North Carolina, 55%, South Carolina, 57%, Tennessee, 56%, Texas, 53%. And added to that now is Louisiana. There are 2 state races that have tightened up since we reported last. The first one is in Virginia. The popular vote there, the tabulated vote with 2/3 of the precincts in, now show Carter and Ford splitting it even. The race there centers around President Ford's strength in the central part of the state, in small towns, in the rural areas. Jimmy Carter is staying in the race because of the large turnout by blacks and a heavy vote in the large cities, Richmond, Newport News, Hampton, and Norfolk. The second tight race in the South is in the Florida presidential race, and that reveals that Jimmy Carter is barely holding his own in the Panhandle, which is a traditional Democratic part of Florida, and in the so-called condo vote, the huge vote that comes out of the condominiums of South Florida, Carter there is splitting with Jerry Ford. That one will go down to the wire. So, Walter, out of the 13 southern states, Carter now has 9, and we're holding for 4 more. George or Walter?
All right. Quentin Burdick has won his seat again in North Dakota. That's a CBS News estimate in the state of North Dakota. Incumbent Senator Burdick has won over Robert Straup's challenge by a rather hefty 2-to-1 margin, 65 to 35%, according to our estimate. In Wisconsin, Senator Proxmire has been returned as expected. Won re-election easily there, although we don't have our percentage. Well, this is the actual vote in so far. Proxmire 72 and York 28%. No, that's our estimate. I'll take that back. But Proxmire wins easily as expected in the state of Wisconsin. Now, in some of those very close states on the presidential race, let's take a very quick look at them. In Illinois, 11% of the vote is in, and Carter has moved into a 58% lead. In Illinois, in Michigan, 14% of the vote is in. Carter has got a lead there of 56% in the president's home state. In Maine, 6% of the vote in, and Carter's got a lead in that traditionally Republican state, 51%. Maryland, 56% of the vote in, and Carter's got a 51% lead in Maryland. In New Jersey, nearly half the vote in, 43%, and Ford is holding on to his lead. He's got 52% there now, but that's less than he had a few moments ago by about 1%. In New York, the first 10% of the votes have been counted, and Ford has jumped into an early lead of 54% in New York. In Pennsylvania, 1/3 of the vote in, 35%, and Carter's now moved into a lead in Pennsylvania. He was trailing there. He's now in the lead with 51%. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. It was a beautiful day across the country, and the reports earlier were that it might even be a record turnout of the vote. According to our CBS News, a look across the country, though, right at the moment, it looks to us as if the vote will be just about at the same 55% margin that was reported in 1972. Around 82 million persons will have voted. That's more, of course, because there are more people registered to vote, but the percentage of the eligible voting looks like it may run right around 55. No records there, and nowhere near the 63% recorded in 1960, for instance. And now in the state of Colorado, CBS News can estimate on the basis of our sample precincts that President Ford will win in his skiing state, defeating Southerner Jimmy Carter 54 to 44, the Rocky Mountain state of Colorado, for its 7 electoral votes. The 1/4 of the precincts have been counted now. 26% have been tabulated. Carter holds on, 52 to 47%. He now has 11.25 million. Ford, 10.33 million votes. And in the electoral vote, it comes to 37 or more now, because we have to add Colorado onto that. 44 for Senator Ford, and for President Ford, for Governor Carter, it's 133 electoral votes. They come from these places, for Ford, Indiana, Connecticut, Kansas, New Hampshire, and Nebraska. For Carter, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, West Virginia, North Carolina, District of Columbia, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Delaware, and Louisiana. And now we're getting our first returns from the Middle West, and it's my pleasure to bring to you Leslie Stahl.
Thank you, Walter. The West is the area of the country where President Ford says he must win most of those electoral votes in order to offset Jimmy Carter's gains in the South. New Mexico, the turnout has been so high that the polls have had to stay open a half hour later because of the long lines. New Mexico is the country's perfect bellwether. Since it became a state in 1912, it has never been wrong. According to our tabulated vote tonight, with 30% of the vote in, You can see that President Ford is leading with 53% of the vote, but so far, according to our CBS News sample precincts, it is still too close to call. Carter appears to be off to a significant lead in New Mexico in the Spanish-speaking areas. He is the first president in many years who can speak fluent Spanish himself, and the popular Democratic governor has been out campaigning for him. Ford had been ahead in the polls there, but Carter has apparently caught up. In the New Mexico Senate race, according to the tabulated vote, with 29% of the precincts in, Harrison Schmitt, an attractive young 41-year-old former astronaut who walked on the moon, has 59% of the vote, and Senator Montoya, running for a third term, Joseph Montoya, has only 41% of the vote. According to our CBS News estimate, Harrison Schmitt, according to our estimate, he has won that election with 57% of the vote. He will get 57%. That is not so much of an upset as it may appear at first. Montoya has been charged with conflict of interest charges, which is ironic for a man who served on the Watergate Committee. Also, in recent days, he charged that Harrison Schmitt, as I said, an astronaut, was no better than the experimental monkeys they used to send up to the moon in the, or send up in orbit in the early days of the space shots, and that infuriated most of the voters in the state and apparently doomed Montoya. So there is one veteran senator who has been defeated. As Walter said, CBS News is estimating that President Ford will carry the state of Colorado. That was expected. President Ford has to win this whole area in order to win the election, the whole Rocky Mountain state. The tabulated vote, with 3% of the precincts in, President Ford has 62% of the vote to Jimmy Carter's 36%. According to our CBS News estimate, the president will win that state with 55% of the vote. President Ford vacations in Vail, Colorado, and apparently the voters in that state consider that it is his home state. So, Walter, we're getting our returns in very, very slowly. As in that Montoya race, you will see all over the West, in the Senate races, non-politicians like Harrison Schmitt running against veteran congressmen and senators, and we may see some upsets tonight.
Leslie, did you see anything about this story? I saw on the news wires that in California there's considerable concern about the way the candidates are listed on the voting machines, and a lot of concern because apparently the lever for Carter is really about halfway onto the Maddox side of the ballot, and a lot of people apparently feel that they voted for Maddox by mistake.
Well, this is apparently true in the San Francisco area, which is an area that Carter is supposed to do well in. It's considered the more Democratic part of the state, and it's quite disturbing to the Carter people. I've talked to them, and they're quite upset.
In Maryland, our CBS News estimate is that Jimmy Carter has won the state of Maryland. It's been very close through the tabulated vote in the early part of the evening, but our CBS News estimate is that when all of those votes are in, it will be Carter, 52% to 48% for President Ford, adding another state to the long Carter list and putting him over the halfway mark to his 270 electoral votes if he's to win the presidency. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76, Election Night. From CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, this portion is sponsored by Mailgram, impact of a telegram at a fraction of the cost. Now here again is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening again. Only in the far west are polls still open, and it looks like it's just about as close a race as the pollsters told us it was going to be. With now 29% of the national precincts counted, Jimmy Carter holding on, as he has for the last couple of hours, to a 52% lead in the popular vote. He now has 12.5 million votes to 11.75 million votes for President Ford. They break down in the electoral vote. 270 are needed, you know, and now Carter has gotten over half of that number. He has 143 to Ford's 44. They come from these states: Ford, Indiana, Connecticut, Kansas, New Hampshire, Nebraska, and Colorado. He's taken those central United States states as well as Connecticut, which he hoped would be an omen of things to come in the eastern states. Carter has taken a long list of states for his total 143 votes, nearly all of the South as expected. He's taken Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, West Virginia, the District of Columbia, Tennessee and Texas, a big win there for him, Arkansas and Massachusetts in the east, Delaware. He's taken Rhode Island, Louisiana. That was expected to be a close one, but that has fallen into Carter's total, and the state of Maryland. In the Senate races, there were 33 up tonight, 22 Democratic seats, 11 Republican seats. So far, the Democrats have won 15, most of those the seats they expected to hold, and the Republicans have won 6, including seats they expected to hold, but they have gained some, and so have the Democrats. The Republicans actually have gained 4 seats that were held by the Democrats before. The Democrats have gained 3 from the Republicans for a net gain of 1 for the Republicans in the new Senate. As before, the previous Senate, the Democrats had a big margin there, 62 to 38, and this will hardly turn over control of the Senate to the Republicans. It's a start for them. They have taken seats from the Democrats now so far in Indiana, in Missouri, and let me see where else they have taken states from the Democrats. Well, I'll get that one for you. In Rhode Island, of course, also, where John Chaffee has won in Rhode Island. The Democrats have taken seats from the Republicans in the states of Maryland and in Tennessee and in New York. Now for the gubernatorial races, the state houses. There are 14 up, 8 Democratic, 6 Republicans. The Republicans have won 4 and the Democrats 4. They're splitting those so far. They have traded a few of those. The Republicans have taken 2 seats from the Democrats, and the Democrats 2 seats from the Republicans. The Democrats have taken seats in North Carolina and in West Virginia. The Republicans have taken seats from the Democrats in Illinois and in Delaware. In the House, before we get to that, let me tell you that our CBS News estimate is in for the state of Minnesota, and as expected, Jimmy Carter has won Minnesota. That Democratic farmer labor state has gone for the challenger from Georgia, probable final percentage 56 to 42%. Gene McCarthy, who at one time represented Minnesota in the United States Senate, got 2% of the vote in his home state. And in Florida, an important call we've been looking forward to receiving, finding out who won that state that was thought to be a toss-up in these last few days of the campaign. Jimmy Carter held on in Florida. He will win there when all the votes are tabulated, according to our CBS News estimate, 53 to 47%. And that's another big boost for Jimmy Carter. He's held on in a state where Ford was making a hard and strong last-minute challenge. In the House of Representatives, with 435 seats at stake, the Democrats have won 187, the Republicans 89. The Republicans needed to take 76 seats from the Democrats tonight in order to win control of the next House of Representatives, and they are probably not going to do that tonight. Eric Severide and Bill Moyers have been watching Jimmy Carter's performance among suburban voters. Gentlemen, how's it look out there in the suburbs?
Well, that's one of the things that keeps coming back to your mind, these figures that seem a little surprising compared to what we thought earlier was going to happen anyway. We'd all been told that Ford was going to do extremely well among the independent voters, a great portion of whom are now living in the suburbs. But he's not doing as well as we've been led to believe. Carter running slightly ahead of him in most of the suburbs reported so far. And of course, that's where most Americans, if not most Americans, but that's the typical American life today. There are more people living in suburbs than in central cities or in small towns or on farms. And suburbanites used to be fairly well-heeled, well-established people, generally voted pretty conservative with taxes on mind, maybe more than employment or wages. What's changed about the suburbs?
Great migration. Great migration from the cities of the working class, the blue-collar workers, the firemen, the policemen, civil servants who had heretofore lived in the cities have now come out to the suburbs, and they brought with them very ancient democratic instincts, intuitions, and aspirations. And that's made a big difference in the Democratic vote in many of the suburbs. I'm impressed, Eric, with the fact that this is shaping up as a basically non-ideological race. There is no sharp contrast between the two parties. There are differences, but no great contrasts. There are no sharp contrasts between the personalities of the two men. So partisanship and self-interest are asserting themselves in this election, and it could well be decided by the fact that there are simply more Democrats than Republicans. Somebody said Republicans sleep in twin beds, which is why there are probably more Democrats than there are Republicans. And so with Democrats outnumbering Republicans 2-1, on that breakdown you have the trend that you see running in the presidential race, at least. It's too early to call, but of course the reassertion of the old Democratic coalition, the Catholics, the South, the white vote, the blacks, is a very encouraging sign for Carter. On the South, I have to say that as a Southerner, that is probably one of the most historic turns of this 1976 election. Whether Carter wins or loses, he has freed the South from the grips of George Wallace, and he's freed Texas from the clutches of John Connally. And the Democratic Party now finds itself able in the South to fight its battles on economic lines and not on racial lines. Very encouraging, it seems, to a lot of us.
Bill, there's some other encouraging little notes here and there. Some signs the Republic may not be going to the dogs all that rapidly. The very scholarly people 6 weeks ago said the total vote would be below 50% for the first time in 50 years. It's not. It's running 55. It's normal. The Senate is trading in Montoya and Hartke for people like Sarbanes of Maryland, a Rhodes Scholar, Pat Moynihan of New York, a certified card-carrying 24-carat intellectual. At least the level of rhetoric ought to rise considerably, which should interest the press gallery at the Senate next year. Back now to Walter Cronkite.
Our CBS News estimate, gentlemen, is that in Vermont, as expected, President Ford has won that once solidly Republican state. He will probably come out of the state with about a 59% margin in Vermont, 53% margin over Carter, and with Gene McCarthy picking up about 2% of the vote in Vermont. Also in Minnesota, no surprise to anyone, the hero of Democratic farmer-labor politics in Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, who recently underwent serious operation, as you know, and is now recovering, has won his Senate race there, 75 to 25% over Gerald Brecke, his Republican challenger. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. In the popular vote across the nation, almost 1/3 of the precincts have been counted. 31% of them are in, and Carter has dropped back 1 percentage point. Ford has come up 1 percentage point from the figures that had held solid for almost 2 hours here. Carter now has 51% and Ford 48% of that popular vote. Carter 13,893,000, Ford 12,879,000, just 1,020,000 or so behind. In the electoral vote, it is now Carter 170. He needs 100 more to go over the top. President Ford has 47 electoral votes. Dan Rather, tell us about the races in the Middle West.
Walter, it's make-or-break time for Gerald Ford. As you've outlined, you and Roger, the tide has run out on Mr. Ford in the South. In the East, still undetermined, but doesn't look like he's going to do as well as he had hoped in the East. If Gerald Ford cannot carry 4 states in the Midwest that we now have some figures on, Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, and Illinois, it's turn out the lights for him. But he is still alive. For those of you at home who see those figures for Carter go up on the board and say, well, it looks like it's all over, it isn't over yet, and here's why. In Ohio, with 36% of the precincts reporting this is the actual tabulated vote, practically a dead heat. Can you believe it? Now, while Carter is carrying the area in and around Cleveland, he's only doing about 1 percentage point better than Hubert Humphrey did 8 years ago when Humphrey lost Ohio. Mr. Ford in Ohio is piling up margins in the suburbs and rural and small town areas. Ford's hopes are still very much alive in Ohio. In Michigan, 21 big electoral votes there. 25% of the precincts in with the tabulated vote. Carter is out to a lead, 55% to 44%. Mr. Ford seems to be holding on in areas outside of Detroit. That Carter lead is basically the big lead that he piled up in Detroit in Michigan. Both candidates, of course, wound up their campaigns in Mr. Ford's home state. The Carter people believe that Leonard Woodcock and the United Auto Workers' big vote turnout in Michigan could spell the difference, but it's too early to say. In Missouri, it looks neck and neck in the rural, small-town areas which Democrats have lost in the last 2 presidential races, with 44% of Missouri's precincts reporting. Carter with a 55% lead. In southern Missouri, Carter is doing much better than Democrats usually do. This could be a result of people in that part of the state being able to identify more easily with Carter's southern and rural background, the so-called accent theory. The southern accent runs strong in southern Missouri, and that's where Carter is doing very well. This also seems to be the case in southern Illinois. Carter running a dead heat with Mr. Ford in southern Illinois. In Illinois as a whole, 19% of the precincts in and tabulated. Carter with a 54% margin in Illinois. Now, however, the daily margin in Chicago was not nearly as large as it has been in some past races, and the Republicans picked up the gubernatorial seat in Illinois. Again, it looks very, very close. So there you have it, Walter. Still close. Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, and Illinois. If Mr. Ford doesn't carry at least 3 of those 4 states, and possibly all 4 of them, you can pour water on the fire and call in the dogs, because the hunt will be over and Mr. Carter will have won it.
I like your metaphor. And the metaphor in the East, Pennsylvania, 50% of the vote is in there now, and Carter has a 52 to 47% lead in Pennsylvania, but in New York, with a third of the vote in, Ford has a 53 to 47% lead, and in New Jersey, with half the vote in there, Ford is leading also 52 to 47%, with all of those races very, very close, obviously, for the big blocks of electoral votes still to come. Bruce Morton has the latest results of our CBS News poll. Bruce?
Walter, President Ford is running a little better with our sample, our 10,000-person sample of voters, than Republican candidates for the Congress are. Our interviewers asked all their subjects which candidate for the House they'd picked, and the Democrats came out way ahead. 58% of the voters in our sample said they were for the Democratic candidate in their district, against just 41% for the Republican. So it looks as if all those advanced predictions of another heavily Democratic House of Representatives will probably turn out to be about right, which means that a lot of the people who were in the Congress last year will be in the Congress again next year. Oddly enough, when we asked voters in our last pre-election poll, the one that we did over the weekend, who was to blame for the way government works, 68% of them blamed the Congress. Only 13% blamed the president. Still, it looks as if voters somehow don't blame their own congressman. He'll probably soon be back while Mr. Ford is in a tough fight. Republicans, on the whole, have been a little more loyal than Democrats, voting for Ford if they voted for the Republican for Congress, but both parties seem to have closed ranks pretty well after the primary fights of the spring. The Republicans' basic problem is that they're the smaller party with fewer ranks to close. One other note about the turnout, Walter. We've been checking around using our vote profile analyses in the various states, and you get a mixed bag in the East and Midwest, up in some states, down in others, but in the South, clearly having a Southerner did something. The turnout in every single Southern state seems to be way up. Walter?
Bruce, I noticed also in your polls, I got some of the information over here at my desk, that on the income levels, it's about as some pollsters had predicted, that Ford is taking by about 2 to 1 those people with family incomes of $20,000 and over. Carter taking by about the same margin those with family incomes of $8,000 and under. In the $8,000 to $20,000 income bracket, it's Carter by a smaller margin. And those who make, that's $8,000 to $12,000, from $12,000 to $20,000, it's about an even split between Ford and Carter. Rather interesting figures on the income effect of the vote. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment. just as I said it was going to be, it seems to be nip and tuck at this hour of election night, with a third of the nation's precincts counted now. Carter's lead is down to 51%. It once was as high as 53. It's now 51. Ford has 48%. Gene McCarthy has 1%. Carter has 14.75 million votes to almost 13.25 million votes for Jerry Ford. From the South, let's take a look at how the races are shaping up there, or have shaped up in the case of most of them, Roger.
It's almost over, not quite. A few still holding out as the clock moves on. The Florida call that we had a little earlier is interesting only because that was the one state George Wallace went into and campaigned. He campaigned in the northwest part of Florida, the so-called Panhandle, but up there Carter didn't do as well as most Democrats generally do. Here are the votes from Florida, 70% of the precincts in. Carter the winner, or Carter carrying 53% of the vote. The CBS News VPA vote profile analysis shows Carter with 53%. The two remaining tough races in the South for Carter are number one, Mississippi. And if we can take a look at Mississippi, you'll see almost a third of the precincts in. Carter leading about 52% to Ford's 47%. The big guns came into Mississippi. The Republicans sent in Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, and the Democrats countered with George Wallace, and the firing isn't over there yet. And the second tight race in the South is Oklahoma, about more than 3/4 of the precincts in, and Carter trailing Ford by about 3 percentage points. Carter is doing well in Oklahoma, only in the southeast portion of the state, that part of Oklahoma known as Little Dixie. So we're waiting on two more, Walter: Oklahoma, Mississippi, 3 more, and Virginia.
With Harrison Jack Schmitt, who walked on the moon, joining John Glenn in the United States Senate. That gives us, he comes from New Mexico, you know, and defeated the incumbent Joseph Matoya there tonight. Well, that gives us 2 astronauts in the United States Senate out of 100 members. That is 2% of the Senate. And if the Supreme Court's one-man, one-vote rule applies to professional and occupations, this is a vast overrepresentation in the United States Senate for astronauts, because they are in the United States population. They represent 0.0000002% of the U.S. population, 10 millionths of the population, and yet they're 2% of the United States Senate. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
And hello again, and we have a CBS News estimate on the presidential returns in Montana. Our CBS News estimate is that President Ford will win Montana. That had been expected. We think that the final returns will show Ford with about 57% of the vote to 43% for Jimmy Carter. Now, there are now 36% of the precincts in from across the United States, and Carter's lead is still at 51%, almost 16 million votes now for Carter to almost 15 million for President Ford, 51 to 48%. The electoral vote shows Ford now with 51 electoral votes, Carter with 170 electoral votes. 270 are needed, so Carter's 100 electoral votes away, Ford 119 electoral votes away. In Washington, Fred Graham talked with James Baker, the chairman of the President Ford Committee, about how this election night's going so far.
Things are going pretty much the way we expected them to go. We're trailing in those states that we thought we'd be trailing in, and we're leading in those states that we had hoped to be leading in at this stage of the race. We're very happy that we're ahead in New Jersey, which was a state that we didn't have a whole lot of confidence there, but it now looks like we're going to win New Jersey. Michigan, as I understand it, at this stage, we trail by some 70,000 votes. These votes are urban votes. They're the first votes that come in. They're the votes from the major metropolitan areas where we don't do as well. And quite frankly, we think we're going to carry Michigan. We remain very optimistic about Michigan and very confident about Michigan.
Now, when are we going to know? Is this going to go right down to...
I think it's going to be very late tonight before we know, Fred. I think that this race may well be decided on the West Coast. Probably will be, particularly so if the major industrial states of the Midwest don't fall all one way or the other, if they're split, and we think they probably will be split.
So you have to carry California.
That's right, but we think we will carry California.
In that Michigan race, which you heard Mr. Baker talking about, 30% of the vote is in, and Carter has a 54% lead in President Ford's home state. And a couple of other very close and very important Middle Western races. In Illinois, almost a quarter of the precincts have reported 23%. Carter's lead, which was 58% a short while ago, has dropped to 53% there. In that important state, that key state of Ohio, some 40% of the vote has been counted in Ohio, and it still stands at 49% for each Carter and Ford. And now in Utah, as expected, President Ford wins, according to our CBS News estimate, by a 2-to-1 margin, 64 to 35% when all votes are counted. New Jersey was another important state that Mr. Baker was talking about there at Republican National Headquarters, and Mike Wallace can tell us something about it and other tight eastern races. Mike?
As you said, Walter, there are 170 electoral votes at this moment for Jimmy Carter. He's 100 away, and 3 industrial states in the East can give him 85 of those 100, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Let's take a look at New York first of all. With 1/2 of all of the precincts reporting in the state of New York, as you can see, Gerald Ford is still far, I say far, 4% ahead of Jimmy Carter. And that's a little difficult to understand in view of the fact that Pat Moynihan defeated Jim Buckley by 10 points. And that race is all decided in New York. We are not sure, our decision desk is not quite sure what to do about our sample precincts. Therefore, we are not going to try any effort at calling who's going to win those 41 electoral votes in the state of New York. Go to Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, 56% of that vote is now in. And Carter is ahead by 5 points in the state of Pennsylvania. The CBS News estimate is that at this moment he's ahead by 3 points, 27 very important electoral votes. A tough state, a toss-up all along, conceivably still to Ford, but more likely at this moment to Carter. You mentioned New Jersey, 17 electoral votes. 54% of the precincts in New Jersey are reporting, and Gerald Ford is indeed holding on by 5 points in New Jersey, so those 3 states are indeed going to go on down to the wire. Just one note from New Jersey: legalized gambling, as you know, in one form or another, is under consideration in several states. A referendum in New Jersey to permit gambling casinos only in Atlantic City, to turn it, some people say, into a kind of Las Vegas East. That measure is apparently gaining approval, 56 to 44%. 2 years ago, a measure to allow casino gambling statewide in New Jersey failed by 3 to 2. So apparently, Walter, you'll be able to give up the office pool and take your car down to Atlantic City.
The state of Wyoming, as expected, continuing President Ford's solid sweep out there in the western and northwestern states. He has won, according to our CBS News estimate, Wyoming. The final percentage we don't have an estimate on quite yet. CBS News coverage of Election 76 will continue in a moment.
He's leading Carter 52 to 48, and it just doesn't seem to make sense. Gene McCarthy, I think we see him with virtually no kind of a write-in vote. There's been some kind of a breakdown in one of the machines up in Erie County. Maybe that has something to do with it, but the fact remains that we just don't know how to account for what is going on in New York State.
What would Erie County be expected to do?
Erie County would probably go Ford.
Ford. So that wouldn't tilt the balance then either. even if
No,
Perry came in?
no.
According to our CBS News estimate now, a report on the state of Utah, and there an upset victory in a sense. It was expected to be very, very close, but a longtime incumbent, the Democratic Senator Frank Moss, has been ousted by Republican Orrin Hatch. Our estimate is that Orrin Hatch will win in Utah by around 53 to 47%. So the Democratic incumbent Moss loses that seat. That was one of the toss-up seats. It was expected to be close tonight, but it was thought that Moss had a fighting chance to hold on. He did not. And now from the Middle West, a report from Dan Rather. Dan?
Walter, if you like politics, you got to love it in the Midwest tonight. So many things are close. First of all, in North Dakota, the Democrats hold on to the governorship there. Arthur Link has been reelected according to our CBS News estimate. Now, let's look over the Senate races in the Midwest. That is our CBS News estimate of Link's winning margin in North Dakota. There are 8 Midwest Senate seats at stake tonight, 6 Democrat, 2 Republican. We have results on 6 of the races. Democrats have won 4 of them, including 3 incumbents, and Republicans have picked up 2. It breaks down this way. The 2 Republicans who have won previously Democratic seats are John Danforth in Missouri and Richard Lugar in Indiana. The Democratic incumbent winners include William Proxmire in Wisconsin, Hubert Humphrey in Minnesota, and Quentin Burdick in North Dakota. In addition, Donald Regal retained for the Democrats the seat held by retiring Philip Hart of Michigan. The 2 Senate races still up in the air in the Midwest, 2 Republican-held seats in Ohio and Nebraska. In the Nebraska race, still undecided, Omaha Mayor Edward Zirinsky, the Democrat who recently converted from Republican, is running very strongly in the Omaha area, including Douglas County. His Republican opponent, Congressman John McCollister, the hand-picked successor to retiring Senator Roman Ruska, the Republican, is doing well in the western farm areas of the state. Now, a Democrat being elected in Nebraska is about as rare as an ivory bill woodpecker, but it could happen in that Zirinsky-McCollister race. We'll have to see. The other Midwest Senate race still too close to call, the Ohio rematch between incumbent Senator Robert Taft and Democrat Howard Metzenbaum. Metzenbaum running, like William Jennings Bryan, for the 3rd time. Unlike Bryan, Metzenbaum may find himself 3rd time lucky. Metzenbaum is doing well in the northern industrial areas of Ohio, while Taft is doing well in central and southern parts of the state, those areas traditionally Republican. For anyone who says this election is over, I'm here to tell you, not so. One of the more popular bumper stickers in the Midwest, as I traveled it, Walter, among the college students, was honk when the election is over. Not time for the horns yet. This one isn't over.
Okay, Dan. The results from some of those important states in the East, we can take a very quick look again at what's happening in those critical states of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. In New York, it's now 50% of the vote in, half of the vote, with 52% for Ford and 48% for Carter. In New Jersey, it's 59% of the vote in, 51% for Ford and 47% for Carter. Carter's closing the gap a little bit there in New Jersey. In Pennsylvania, 59% of the vote in, and Carter holding on to a 52 to 47% margin in Pennsylvania. In Wisconsin now, that state, which was believed to be leaning toward Carter, but not certain at all, has fallen to him, according to our CBS News estimate. Carter has Wisconsin by a narrow margin, 51 to 47% when all the votes are counted in Wisconsin. And in Pennsylvania, a call, Mike, on your important senatorial race in Pennsylvania. The Republican John Heinz from Pittsburgh, heir to the pickle, relish, and bean fortune, has won in Pennsylvania over the scion of the longtime Democratic leadership family in Philadelphia, William Green. He's won with a 53 to 47% margin when all of the vote is counted in Pennsylvania. A Republican seat being held on now by young John Heinz. That was the seat of the retiring minority leader of the Senate, Hugh Scott. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York. This portion is sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company on behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers. Ford wants to be your car company. Now here again is Walter Cronkite.
And our CBS News estimate is that the big block of 27 electoral votes in Pennsylvania will go to Jimmy Carter. Carter will win in Pennsylvania 51 to 48%, according to our CBS News poll of selected precincts when all of the votes are in. And that's a big and important win for Carter as he moves on toward what he hopes will be the majority of 270 electoral votes. He's now, with Pennsylvania, gone over the 200 mark. He now has an electoral votes of 208. He needs just 62 more for the 270 vote that it takes to win in the Electoral College. President Ford has 58 electoral votes. The Ford votes have come from the following states: from Indiana, Connecticut, Kansas, New Hampshire, Nebraska, Colorado, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming, and in the east again, Vermont. A total of 58 electoral votes. Carter's votes come from the states you see now, marked on your map there. A long list of them, and I won't read them all to you. The important ones so far have been in Texas and Florida and Pennsylvania. They're all, of course, important to these candidates, but those were three states that were believed to be toss-up states and with large numbers of electoral votes that it had needed in order to win this election, and Carter has now put them in his column. In the Senate races, 33 races are being run tonight, as you know, or have been run in the campaigns. The running is over. It's only the counting now. 11 of those seats held by Republicans, 22 by Democrats. So far, the Democrats have won 16 of the Senate seats, and the Republicans have won 8. There are still 9 Senate seats outstanding. Most of those seats are ones that had been expected to be held where they are. But on the other hand, let's look at this. The name of the game, of course, is to take seats away from the other party, not just hold even. And the Republicans are doing a better job of that tonight than are the Democrats. They have taken 5 seats from the Democrats so far. The Democrats have taken just 3 seats from the Republicans. So in the new Senate so far, the Republicans have assured themselves of a 2-seat gain if they can hold on like this during the rest of the evening. Where those seats were changed, let's take a quick look. If in Maryland the Democrat won, defeated the incumbent Republican Mr. Bell there. In New York, Pat Moynihan, the former United Nations ambassador, defeated the incumbent conservative and Republican Jim Buckley. And in Tennessee, John Sasser defeated the incumbent Republican Bill Brock, rather. And the Republican seats were won from Democrats in these states. Richard Lugar won in Indiana, upsetting and unseating the 3-time incumbent, 3-term incumbent, Vance Hartke. In Missouri, John Danforth defeated Warren Hearns for the seat that had been held by the 4-term Senator Stuart Symington, Democrat, of course. In New Mexico, the astronaut Harrison Jack Schmidt ousted from the Senate Joseph Montoya, the Democrat. And in Rhode Island, an open seat there, John Chaffee, former Secretary of the Navy, defeated Richard Lober. In Utah, Orrin Hatch, the Republican, upset and ousted from the Senate the Democratic Senator Moss. In the gubernatorial races, there are 14 of those at stake tonight. So far, 10 have been decided, and the Democrats have won 6, the Republicans 4. And in the question of taking seats from one another, well, that's an even push so far in the gubernatorial races. Republicans have taken 2, and the Democrats 2. The Republicans won in Delaware and Illinois. Pierre DuPont winning in Delaware, John Thompson in Illinois, and in the Democrats have won in North Carolina, returning that normally Democratic state to the Democratic column, and John J. Rockefeller IV has won in West Virginia, defeating Cecil Underwood for the seat vacated there by a retiring Democratic governor. The House races All 435 are up, as you know, and so far all but 94 have either been decided or they are leading or leaning far enough for us to put them on our list at any rate at this moment. The Democrats have won or are leading from 230 seats. The Republicans have won or are leading for 111 seats. Jimmy Carter is going to attend a rally in Atlanta later tonight. Ed Rabel is there too. Ed?
Boulder, there are now 25,000 people in this exhibit hall in the World Congress Center. After 25,000 got in here, the authorities wouldn't permit any more to come in, even though there are thousands outside demanding to come in, all wanting to see and hear Jimmy Carter. Carter, meanwhile, is in his own hotel suite not far from here. He's there with his family and members of his staff watching the returns come in. It may be a long wait for these people. We hear now that Carter does not intend to come down to address them until Ford has conceded. And none of his staff members either have appeared here, although there have been repeated calls for their appearance, and we're waiting for them right now.
Okay, Ed, it may be a long night until President Ford concedes, although Pennsylvania is a big boost for the Carter totals. He's still got some way to go. He needs 62 more electoral votes, and the states where those will come from, the big states, where he must really expect them at this stage, since he's already got his southern bloc in to his column, and most of the Middle Western, the smaller Middle Western and Western states are expected to go for Ford. Well, he's going to need some of these big ones. And here's the way it looks in those big states right now. Illinois, 35% of the vote has been counted in Illinois. Carter's lead has dropped by 1 percentage point in Illinois. He's now down to 51% lead there. It's a very narrow lead in Illinois. And Big Jim Thompson won that that gubernatorial race for the Republicans with such a big margin. It's going to be tough, as Dan Rather's been telling us, for Carter in Illinois. In Michigan, President Ford's home state, 37% of the vote is in, and Carter has dropped there too. Now he's at 52%. That's a percentage point lower than he was a little while ago. In Missouri, he's dropped a percentage point, 53% of the vote in there, and he's at 54%, Carter. Ohio, just about 50% of the vote is in Ohio, a critical swing state, and it is holding, as you see now, about 50 to 48% for Ford. In the East, in New Jersey, 60% of the vote is in New Jersey, and Ford's lead there is dropping a little bit, but he's still holding on. It's now 63%, and it's 51% for Ford. In New York, that surprise in New York, 62% of the vote, and Ford's holding on to a 52% lead. That's what he's had for the last hour or so. In Pennsylvania, we were able to call that one a moment ago for Jimmy Carter. Well, we'll be back in a moment with more CBS News election night coverage. "41% of the national precincts counted, 51% for Carter and 48% for Ford." And now, Mike Wallace, what does it look like in the East?
Well, you talked about Pennsylvania, and that is a very important state for Jimmy Carter. Gerald Ford's manager in Pennsylvania, Drew Lewis, said that if Ford loses Pennsylvania, that may be the ball game, and indeed it may be. Let's take a look at that Pennsylvania vote for just a moment. With 64% of the precincts reporting, as you can see, Carter is about 150,000 votes ahead of Ford. But CBS News estimates that when all the votes are in Pennsylvania, Carter will take 51% to Ford's 48% of that vote. Eugene McCarthy will take 1%. Lester Maddox will have about 12,000 votes. We've been able to break down what happened to some degree now in Pennsylvania. In black areas, Jimmy Carter took 91% of the vote in our black precincts. In Philadelphia, 63% of the vote. In large cities, 59% of the vote. In each of those spots, he ran somewhat ahead of Hubert Humphrey's run against Richard Nixon back in 1968. And that conceivably could have made the difference for Jimmy Carter. As a matter of fact, as you add up the vote in the black areas of Philadelphia, where we have our sample precincts, it begins to look as though the black vote in Pennsylvania could have made the difference for Jimmy Carter. Now let's move to New York. Still a mystery. 62% of the precincts reporting, and Ford still running 52% to Jimmy Carter's 48%, and no one is quite sure yet where all those votes are coming from. And incidentally, there's a note about New York. The New York State Board of Elections is preserving all overseas absentee ballots that arrive at a local election board after Election Day if they've been postmarked on or before November 2nd. Almost 400,000 absentee ballots have been mailed out to New Yorkers overseas. Generally speaking, rule of thumb, 90% of them are sent back, so it's conceivable that the New York vote could go on for several days yet before it's decided. And finally, in the East, New Jersey, 64% of the precincts now reporting. Gerald Ford still holding on to that tenuous 51 to 48% lead, and we have no CBS News estimate as to which direction that is finally going to wind up, Walter.
So in other words, if we get a really close return tonight from the rest of the United States, that big block of 41 electoral votes in New York could hang on those absentee ballots, and we wouldn't know the result of the national election for days or weeks.
There was some evidence that the ballots had not been received overseas in time to be marked and back on Election Day.
I gather that both the State Department and the Justice Department both had asked that these ballots be impounded and special consideration given for that reason. They'd gotten a lot of reaction from overseas because the ballots weren't received in time. We'll be back in a moment with more CBS News election night coverage. We're inching up toward the halfway point in the count of the nation's precincts on this 48th presidential election, our bicentennial election. With 47% of the precincts in now, Carter is holding on to his 51% lead over Ford's 48%, 20.5 million votes for Ford, almost 19 million votes, or rather 20.5 for Carter, 19 for Ford. It's very, very close, as had been predicted. In the electoral vote, President Ford has got 58 electoral votes so far. Carter, 208 electoral votes. Carter is just 62 away from the magic number of 270 to put him over the top, but getting those last 62 are going to be difficult. Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, California, all are expected to be very close. The California polls have just closed. Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois' counts are very close indeed. Bruce Morton has been studying our CBS News poll to see how the voters perceive the candidates. Bruce?
Walter, like any election, as you know, this one has to a degree been based on personality, on what the voters were looking for in a president, on what they thought they saw in Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Our interviewers asked their subjects, 13,000 odd of them in the state the poll is in at the moment, to choose from a list of attributes. 40% of them said they voted for their candidate because he was the more capable. They named that more than any other single thing. And most of the ones who said that was important voted for Gerald Ford. 23% of our sample said they were for their man because he was their party's candidate. Those party regulars, more often than not, went for Jimmy Carter. 22% said they voted for their candidate because they trusted him. President Ford was the winner on that trust issue. What did voters dislike about Gerald Ford? The Nixon pardon tops that list. 33% of our sample mentioned it. Ford's ties to business came second. The charge that he doesn't run the government came third. What did they dislike about Carter? Well, 31% said they didn't know his stands on the issues. 26% said they don't trust him. So those old ambiguous feelings which have dogged the Carter campaign ever since the early primaries all seem to be alive still today. Some things which not very many people mentioned, our voters didn't choose because of how the candidates performed in those television debates, or so they said. And Walter Mondale and Robert Dole weren't mentioned much either, despite all their campaigning. Only 10% of the voters in our sample said the vice presidential candidates were a factor in choosing the president. Those who did mention it, though, lopsidedly preferred Mondale to Dole. Walter?
Thank you, Bruce. Let's go right now to the western states. We haven't heard from him for a while. Leslie Stahl. Leslie?
Walter, the Rocky State votes are coming in. This was the area of the country that Ronald Reagan won in the primaries. President Ford did not win any of these states. Nevertheless, he is winning there tonight. In the state of Idaho, according to our tabulated vote, with 22% of the precincts in, President Ford has 64% of the votes. According to our CBS estimate, President Ford is leading that state. That is no surprise. Jimmy Carter hardly had a campaign there at all. In the state of Utah, a Senate race, CBS News, as Walter said earlier, estimates that Orrin Hatch, a conservative Republican, has won that race with 53% of the vote. Orrin Hatch defeated 65-year-old Frank Moss, a veteran congressman running for a fourth term. It is a major upset. Orrin Hatch is one of those unknowns, a non-politician who, because of that, seems to be defeating the kind of person who will be defeating these veteran senators all over the West. Orrin Hatch got a lot of money from conservative organizations, and he is quite right-wing in his attitudes, ran against Washington. In Utah, CBS News is now ready to say that Scott Matheson, the Democrat, will win that race, we're estimating, with 55% of the vote. He is defeating Vernon Romney, the Republican who was the Attorney General there. Romney had a very famous Mormon name. You would have thought he would win, but Matheson was backed by the very popular Governor Calvin Rampton, who is retiring. Rampton went on record saying that Vernon Romney was not smart enough to be governor. In the state of Wyoming, we may have a potential upset here with 32% of the precincts in. Malcolm Wallop, an unknown, has 59% of the vote, but I am now being told that CBS News is ready to say that Malcolm Wallop will defeat Gail McGee, veteran congressman. We don't yet know by what percentage, but we are ready to say that Malcolm Wallop, as I have said, has defeated Gail McGee. Again, it's a question of age. Malcolm Wallop is 43 years old. He is a state senator, and as in other states, he's a conservative who ran against Washington, and he ran against the mail service. Gail McGee was chairman of the Post Office Committee. Walter?
In those very tight races now, let's take a very quick look at where they stand. In New Jersey, 65% of the vote has been counted, the precincts at any rate, and Ford is holding on to a 1% margin, 51% or a 3% margin, but he's got 51%. Carter's 48% there. New York has 65% of the precincts counted. Ford holding on to the 51 to 49% lead he has in New York. In Illinois, with 43% of the vote counted there now, Carter holding on again, 51%. Michigan, 39% in Ford's home state, Carter holding on, 52%. In Missouri, 60%, and Carter's improved his standing in Missouri by 1% to 55%. And in Ohio, 54% counted. Carter's dropped back 1 percentage point. It's 50-48 now. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
CBS News continues its coverage of Campaign 76. Election night from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York. This portion is sponsored by Western Union, now serving America with communications satellites. Now here again is Walter Cronkite.
Polls are closed across the continental United States on this election day. More than 50% of the precincts have reported in. CBS News estimate now in the state of Idaho is that President Ford has carried that state as he has been carrying the western and northwestern plain states. He will win by a percentage that we have not calculated quite as yet, but we can put Idaho in President Ford's column according to our CBS News estimate. And in the state of Delaware, Senator William V. Roth, Jr. of Wilmington, has defeated Thomas C. Maloney, the mayor of Wilmington, for his Senate seat. That is Roth's seat. He'll return after one term to the Senate. That percentage about 57% for Roth and 43% for Maloney. Now, with 51% of the national precincts counted, Carter is holding on to his 51% lead. It's been that way for a couple of hours now. Ford has 48% of the vote. Carter, 21,876,000. Ford, 20,343,000. That translates into electoral votes this way. President Ford has 62 electoral votes. Carter has 280 toward the 270 needed. Carter is thus 62 electoral votes short of what is needed to win the presidency. He's having a tough time getting those with the close states of Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, all very, very close. California is just beginning to tabulate, and we have no important returns from that state yet. It's also expected to be close, and this may be a long night's cliffhanger. Phil Jones is in Washington. He can tell us what the mood is at President Ford's campaign headquarters there. Phil?
Walter, we're right now on the grand ballroom floor here at the Sheraton Park Hotel in Washington, D.C., which is the headquarters for the so-called victory celebration tonight. There are about 6,000 to 7,000 people who received invitations to come, and what you have just heard is their applause and their cheering when they just received some good news about how the president is doing in Ohio and Illinois. These people are really sort of isolated from the story tonight. They're getting all of their news on how the election is going from a huge projection screen, which is shown over on the wall here to my left. And what appears on that projection screen is controlled by the President Ford Committee Command Post, which is located in another room here at the Sheraton Park Hotel. They decide what all of these people here should see. Most of these people are folks who have worked for the president's volunteer efforts. They are many government workers who are especially concerned about the future of their jobs. But they were invited for a victory celebration, and at this point, Walter, they certainly aren't throwing in the towel.
I noticed, Phil, that that board said that Ford had won Oklahoma. I don't know how they got those figures precisely yet.
Walter, what they are doing is they are watching you and all of the networks, and they are also taking their own field reports that they have and doing their own reporting. So what you saw up there were their own reports that they have from many of their field people, as well as some of their interpretations of what you were saying.
I just wondered if they had something more than we had, because the tabulated vote from Oklahoma with 97% of the precincts counted shows Ford with just a very narrow lead, and we show in our returns no returns yet.
From California, which shows the president ahead. One thing that we should point out, many of the Ford people here, the strategists, have been very concerned about the early returns that were coming in from the southeast, which were not good this evening. And all of the projections that they have on the president winning this depends on one thing, and that is that they win the state of California. And what they were worried about was that many of the people in California would see all of the bad news in the southeast, and they decide, well, it wasn't worth going to the polls. And what they see right now is themselves on the projection screen.
Okay, Phil. I wonder if they know yet that President Ford lost his voice tonight after all that last-minute speechifying and may not make it down there for a statement to them. However, about an hour ago, Ron Nessen, the news secretary, came out of the White House and said that the president is being treated with a nebulizer, which apparently sprays droplets of water, no medication, he made clear. The president is drinking tea and honey and took a 2-hour nap, and Nessen says that he's resting his voice and it's much better now. So maybe he will be making a statement later on tonight after all. Now, according to our CBS News estimate from the state of Washington, Democrat Dixie Lee Ray has won in Washington for the gubernatorial seat there. She has defeated John Spellman, the Republican challenger, for a seat that had been held by the Republicans. It's a seat the Democrats are taking away, and the person, Dixie Lee Ray, a former Atomic Energy Commissioner, 55 to 45% for Ray when all the votes are in. Ms. Ray was the Atomic Energy Commission head, and she is a proponent of nuclear energy, a position that apparently the people of Washington agreed with in this particular vote. Now, those close states in the Middle West may very well hold the balance in this presidential race, along with New York and New Jersey, which are still showing slight Ford leads with 65% of the vote in each of those states, about a 1% lead for Ford in each state. What about the Middle West, Dan Rather?
Walter, in the 12-state Midwest region, the nation's toss-up belt, 7 states at this hour are too close to call for either Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter. The 5 which we have estimated winners go like this. For Jimmy Carter, Wisconsin, 11 electoral votes. Maybe the biggest shock of the evening thus far for Gerald Ford and his forces that Carter has won Wisconsin. And Minnesota, 10 electoral votes. President Ford has picked up 3 states by our estimate. They are Indiana, 13 electoral votes, Kansas, 7 electoral votes, and Nebraska with 5. In Wisconsin, a state hotly contested where it was thought that Eugene McCarthy might take away some votes from Jimmy Carter, the Democrat has pulled through. Now, what's so surprising about this is that Wisconsin is the birthplace of the Republican Party. This is what our CBS News estimate looks like. The final total in Wisconsin may be along these lines. Not only is it the birthplace of the Republican Party, in the last 3 close presidential elections, we're talking about 48, 60, and 68, the Republicans won Wisconsin. But not tonight. This is what the tabulated vote looks like. 37% of the precincts in and tabulated, with Carter holding about a 53% margin. Jimmy Carter managed a comfortable win in Wisconsin, this despite some pre-election polls showing the state leaning to President Ford. And Melvin Laird, the former Republican congressman from Wisconsin, may need mouth-to-mouth resuscitation because he just was absolutely convinced that President Ford would carry Wisconsin. Laird and many other Republicans worked their hearts out, but it just wasn't to be. Eugene McCarthy, by our estimates, took 2% of Wisconsin's vote, and it was thought that if McCarthy was going to do well anywhere, he would do it in Wisconsin. It is a surprisingly low vote total for the man that some people call the Prince of Castaways, Eugene McCarthy, in Wisconsin. The traditionally rock-ribbed Republican area of Green Bay and the surrounding Fox River Valley area, the one-time home of the late Senator Joseph McCarthy, perhaps tells the Wisconsin story best. Jimmy Carter appears to be holding Gerald Ford to a standoff in those areas of Wisconsin, and in the cities, the Democrat is racking up big margins. Both Ford and Carter had called Wisconsin one of the smaller critical states, and to lose it was a real blow for Gerald Ford. Still at stake in the Midwest, 7 states with 99 electoral votes. In Iowa, 8 electoral votes, still too close to call. Carter running well in the central area around Des Moines and the eastern area of Cedar Rapids and around Dubuque. Democrats enjoy an almost 2-to-1 edge in voter registration in Iowa, but the Republicans have carried the state in the last 2 presidential elections and have controlled the state house for the last 8 years. This is on the tabulated vote in Iowa. Ohio's 25 electoral votes, still too close to call. This could tell the story of the whole election. Mr. Ford running well in and around the Cleveland area, an area heavily Democratic with a high concentration of Eastern European immigrants. That could be significant that he's running that well in the Cleveland and surrounding area. Carter's Ohio strength thus far comes from Columbus in the central part of the state, also in southern Ohio. He's losing in both of those areas, but running better in the southern section of Ohio than Democrats normally do. I have to believe, Walter, that right now is the sweet hour of prayer for Gerald Ford and his supporters. They're still in it, but they need a miracle in the Midwest. I didn't mention Michigan. In Michigan, it's still far too tight to call there. Gerald Ford has a shot, but he can't afford anymore to lose another Midwestern state. And if he loses one more big Western state, I think you'll have to say it's all over.
Dan, I might quarrel with you just a little about that because in the East, things are not going Carter's way at all. It's still a narrow margin for Ford in both New York and New Jersey. Now, that New York state had always been put into the Carter column by almost everybody, with 5-6% lead he had in the polls, and yet now he's losing at 71%. 70% of the voters in, and Ford has 51% of that vote that's been tabulated so far. Most of the New York counties, New York City area is going for Carter, but the outstate's going for Ford, Mike Wallace tells me, and that's the way it looks. So that's 41 electoral votes, and New Jersey, 75% of the vote is in now, and Ford is holding on to his 1% lead there.
Let's be clear about it. No question that if Gerald Ford should pull out New York and or New Jersey, his strength, like Richard Nixon's in 1968, will grow as it heads to the west, and he'd be very much in it, but he still needs those big Midwestern states.
We might remember also the old precedent. No Republican has ever won the White House without Ohio And Illinois has been with the winner ever since it made a mistake in 1916 and voted for Hughes.
That's the reason I say it's a sweet hour of prayer for the Republicans in Ohio, because if they can win it, they're very much alive.
We'll be back in a moment with more CBS News election night coverage. In the Senate races tonight, with 33 races up, 22 Democratic, 11 Republican seats. The Republicans so far have won 9, the Democrats 17, 7 are undecided. The Republicans have gained 6 seats from the Democrats. The Democrats have taken 3 seats from the Republicans, so it's a net gain of 3 for the Republicans. The Republicans have taken seats from the Democratic incumbents in Indiana, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, and taken 2 seats from which Democrats were retiring this year. And the Democrats have taken 3 incumbent Republicans out of the Senate in New York, Maryland, and Tennessee. And Eric Severide and Bill Moyers have been watching the fall of the incumbents from the United States Senate. Bill?
Walter, it seems to us that no matter who wins this election tonight for the White House, the congressional posture is going to be basically unchanged. If Ford is the next president of the United States, win for the first time in his own right, it'll be a little easier for the Senate to uphold his vetoes, but the House remains just about as Democratic as it was and can still harass an incumbent Republican president. If Jimmy Carter is the winner, it's apparent that he will have a receptive Senate and a receptive Democrat, at least in the receptive House of Representatives, at least in the first part of his administration. The interesting thing to us is that there is no consistent pattern to these defeats and victories in the Senate. Each one of them seems to be based on some local, parochial issue that reminds us in these elections just how varied and multicolored the American political fabric really is. J. Glenn Bell, who has lost the Republican seat in Maryland, was the beneficiary a few years ago of a Nixon dirty trick when Charles Colson leaked to Life magazine charges that the incumbent Joseph Tidings was involved in a conflict of interest when Tidings wasn't. It was too late by the time he was cleared for Bell to lose. Well, since then, Chuck Colson's been born again, and so has the Democratic Senate seat in Maryland tonight. In New York, Jim Buckley simply didn't, Eric, pay attention to the casework that's necessary for an incumbent to win. And even those longtime veterans of the Senate who came in 1958 with 1958 with the great liberal win, Moss and Hartke and McGee, they apparently had worn out their welcome in Washington as far as their constituents are concerned in our home. So there's no pattern.
But on the House side, as far as we can see in these early hours, incumbency is doing very well indeed. In the South, I believe it's correct now to say that all 120 of those seats are returned, including about 30 Republicans. The Democrats, I think, picked up what, 43 seats extra ones 2 years ago after in the Watergate election, so-called, when the Republicans lost so terribly badly. And I would guess, if the thing in the South means anything, that most of those people are going to hold those seats. And that's fairly significant because it's your first re-election as a House member that's a real test. Those were Republican seats at one time. If these Democrats get through their first re-election to those seats, then they hold them for quite a long time. No matter how you cut it, we're going to have a strongly Democratic Congress, both House and Senate, for I think, years to come on the basis of this.
Every election creates a new wave of bright young or new faces that cause all of us to wonder who down the road could emerge to contend with the contend to be president a few years from now. If you look at the Republicans, there's some very attractive faces in that new bunch. Danforth in Missouri, Chafee in Rhode Island, Lugar in Indiana. On the Democratic side, there's Moynihan in New York, Sarbanes in Maryland, Democratic governors like Rockefeller in West Virginia, Republican governors like Thompson. I'd say that the renewing cycle of American politics has received a new impetus tonight.
And even, one might add, even scandal or allegations of scandal connected with sex or money don't seem to affect incumbency much. We don't have the full list of those accused of those things. They're all Democrats, by the way, but at least 6 of them are being returned to office, one stepping up to a higher office, Regal in Michigan. So either scandal doesn't mean anything to people anymore, or they carefully separate private life from public life. In any case, back now to Walter Cronkite.
55% of the precincts have been counted across the nation. Carter holding on to that 51 to 48% lead. Gene McCarthy, the independent, has 1% of the vote. Now, Leslie Stahl, how's it going in the West?
Well, Walter, CBS News is ready to estimate that Howard Cannon, the incumbent Democrat in the state of Nevada, will win re-election to the Senate. According to our tabulated vote, do we have a tabulated vote? Perhaps we don't. Anyway, Howard Cannon has been in the Senate for 18 years. He ran against conservative Republican David Towell, 39 years old. Here's our tabulated vote. With 12% of the precincts in, Howard Cannon has 61% of the vote, and CBS News is estimating that he will win that race. David Towell had very little money, had very little support in his state, and it is a case at least of one incumbent Democrat who has won in the West. So far, we have seen that Frank Moss in Utah, Gail McGee in Wyoming, and Joseph Montoya in Montana have all been defeated. In the presidential race in the West, Jimmy Carter has not won any state so far. President Ford has won 5. One of them is the state of Idaho, with 4 electoral votes. CBS News is estimating that President Ford will win that, but according to our tabulated vote, with 36% of the precincts in, President Ford has 61% of the vote. That is no surprise. Idaho is usually a Republican and a conservative voting state. In the state of Washington, as Walter said before, CBS News is estimating that Dixie Lee Ray, an eccentric woman with an unusual lifestyle who is successful in casting herself as a non-politician, according to CBS News, will win that election. The tabulated vote has her with about 57% of the vote. She ran against Republican John Spellman, who is a politician. He was county executive in Seattle and a lackluster candidate. Dixie Lee Ray becomes the second woman in the history of the United States to win a governorship without succeeding her husband, and she is now the second female governor in the United States. Also in the state of Washington, Senator Henry Jackson, according to CBS News, has won re-election. With 15% of the precincts in, Jackson has 76% of the vote. He is not doing as well as he did in his last campaign, but nevertheless he has won handily, as you can see. According to our CBS News estimate, he will win with 75% of the vote. He ran against Republican George Brown, an airline pilot with United Airlines whose campaign never got off the ground. We have now some returns in the state of California, where one of the more interesting Senate races in the country is being held between John Tunney, the Democrat incumbent, a young man, 42 years old, running against S.I. Hayakawa, 70 years old, a college professor. With only 4% of the precincts in, according to the tabulated vote, Hayakawa has 54% to Tunney's 46%. Hayakawa, like Dixie Lee Ray, ran as a non-politician running against Washington. Tunney has had trouble erasing his image as a playboy. We also have some very early returns in the California presidential race. With only 4% of the precincts in, President Ford has 53%, Jimmy Carter 46%, but it is much too early to even tell you what the trend is in California. Ronald Reagan calls California the big casino, and President Ford has said that he cannot win the election without it, so we're watching it very closely.
That Dixie Lee Ray win for the governorship in Washington makes 2 women governors, as you say, the incumbent Ella Grasso, Democrat in Connecticut, and there's one more running tonight. Stella Hackle is running on the Democratic ticket against Tom Snelling in Vermont for the governorship there. But she's running behind as of this moment, but not terribly far behind in Vermont. And if we got 3 women governors, it would be the first time in the nation's history that ever happened. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.